To my daughter Eleanor, who has consistently disappointed me with her lack of business acumen and financial responsibility, I leave the sum of $1,000. The lawyer's voice hung in the air as my brother Michael's expression transformed from practiced grief to barely concealed triumph. My father's final judgment, immortalized in legal prose for everyone to witness. Little did he know that I, his greatest disappointment, had secretly become the controlling investor in the very empire he had built. Growing up as Richard Montgomery's daughter meant existing in the expansive shadow of Montgomery Industries, a telecommunications giant that had made our family name synonymous with success across the Midwest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Our sprawling estate in Lakewood Heights served as both home and unofficial corporate headquarters, with business associates constantly streaming through our palatial living room for impromptu strategy sessions that inevitably excluded me. "Eleanor, why don't you go help Beatrice with dinner?" my father would suggest whenever conversations turned to acquisition strategies or quarterly projections. This wasn't a request, but a dismissal, delivered with the practiced smile of a man accustomed to getting his way in all things. My mother, Caroline, had long ago retreated into the comfortable numbness of her charity work and prescription medications, offering only a sympathetic glance as I was once again banished from the realm of important matters. Michael, 3. Years my senior, had been groomed for succession since childhood. Where I was directed toward home economics and literature, he was tutored in finance and corporate strategy. My father would beam with pride as Michael recited market forecasts during dinner, while my academic achievements at Westfield University were acknowledged with distracted nods if mentioned at all. "Business is in the Montgomery blood," my father would proclaim, clapping Michael on the shoulder. "At least in the male line," he'd add with a pointed glance in my direction. I learned early to hide my fascination with investment strategies and market trends, devouring financial journals in the privacy of my room and monitoring stock fluctuations on my laptop while pretending to work on college essays. My economics professor, Dr. Isabel Franklin, became my clandestine mentor, recognizing a spark that my own father had willfully ignored. "Your analytical thinking is exceptional, Eleanor," she told me during our private advisory sessions. "You have a natural instinct for market movements that can't be taught." By my senior year, I had parlayed my modest trust fund, the one financial gesture my father had made toward my future, into a surprisingly robust investment portfolio. Small, strategic plays in emerging tech companies yielded returns that I immediately reinvested, building a financial foundation entirely separate from my family name. After graduation, I accepted a position at Meridian Capital, a boutique investment firm in Seattle, as far from Lakewood Heights as I could reasonably manage. My father's reaction was predictably dismissive. "Playing with stocks, Eleanor? A glorified secretary position, I suppose," he remarked during one of our increasingly rare phone conversations. "Michael's overseeing the expansion of our Eastern Division, creating real value, not shuffling papers." I swallowed the familiar sting of his disdain and offered no correction. Let him believe what he wanted. The truth was that I had risen, quickly through Meridian's ranks, my intuitive market sense earning the attention of the firm's managing partners. I developed a reputation for identifying undervalued companies poised for explosive growth, my recommendations generating substantial profits for our highest-tier clients. When my father suffered his first heart attack 3 years later, I returned to Lakewood Heights for a tense weekend. The family dynamics remained unchanged, Michael standing as the anointed heir, while I was relegated to the periphery, bringing water and medication as the men discussed the company's direction. "We're facing some liquidity challenges," I overheard my father tell Michael in the study. "Nothing catastrophic, but we'll need to source new investment capital before the Madison acquisition. The timing is delicate." Later that evening, as I helped Beatrice clear the dinner dishes, Michael cornered me in the kitchen. "How's the secretary job?" he asked, leaning against the marble countertop with the casual confidence of someone who has never questioned his place in the world. "Investment analyst," I corrected mildly. "It's going well." Michael snorted. "Still playing with your little stock portfolio? Dad says you've always had unrealistic ideas about your capabilities." I carefully placed a crystal wine glass in the cabinet, using the mundane action to mask the calculations already forming in my mind. We all have our paths, Michael. Upon returning to Seattle, I arranged a meeting with Valerie Torres, Meridian's founding partner and my direct supervisor. "I need your advice on a potential major investment," I began, sliding a folder across her desk. Valerie raised an eyebrow as she reviewed the contents. "Montgomery Industries? That's your family's company, isn't it?" "Yes," I confirmed. "They're preparing for a significant acquisition and seeking capital investment. The company is fundamentally sound, but facing temporary liquidity constraints." "And you want Meridian to invest?" she asked, studying me carefully. "No," I replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "I want to invest personally, but I need to do it through a series of shell companies and investment vehicles that can't be traced." Back to me. Over the next 18 months, I systematically acquired Montgomery Industries stock through a complex network of holding companies and proxy investors. The company's temporary cash flow issues had depressed their share price just enough to create an unprecedented opportunity. Every bonus I earned, every dividend my other investments generated, flowed into my steadily growing position in my father's company. I created Athena Capital Partners as my primary investment vehicle, named for the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, an inside joke that only I appreciated. Through Athena, I purchased substantial blocks of Montgomery stock during periods of volatility, always remaining just under the threshold that would trigger mandatory SEC disclosures. My father's health continued to decline, and with it, his already tenuous relationship with reality. His calls became more frequent but increasingly disconnected, vacillating between barking orders at imagined subordinates and rendering harsh judgments on my life choices. "You've never understood what it takes to build something that lasts," he told me during what would be our final conversation. "Michael has the Montgomery vision. You're too cautious, too analytical. No instinct for the kill." I absorbed the familiar criticism without comment, even as I reviewed the latest acquisition reports showing that Athena Capital Partners had secured a 26% ownership stake in Montgomery Industries, making me the company's largest individual shareholder outside my father himself. When the call came that Richard Montgomery had suffered a fatal stroke, I was in the middle of negotiating Athena's acquisition of another 3% through a distressed investor looking to liquidate their position. I completed the transaction before, booking my flight home, ownership documents securely archived in my encrypted files. The funeral was a public spectacle. Montgomery Industries board members and business associates filling the cavernous cathedral in a performative display of grief. Michael played the role of devastated heir apparent with practiced precision, his arm protectively around our sedated mother as they received condolences from governors and senators who owed their political careers to my father's generous campaign contributions. I maintained my position on the periphery, accepting murmured sympathies with quiet dignity, just another supporting character in the Montgomery family drama. Few bothered to offer more than perfunctory acknowledgments. I was, after all, just Richard's daughter, the one who had fled to Seattle to play with stocks, rather than embrace her birthright in the family business. If only they knew that the unassuming woman in the simple black dress had become the silent power behind the Montgomery throne. 2 days after we laid my father to rest, we gathered in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Whitaker & Sons, the law firm that had managed Montgomery legal affairs for generations. Bernard Whitaker himself presided over the reading of the will, his voice a practiced monotone as he detailed the distribution of my father's considerable estate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To my son, Michael Richard Montgomery. I leave controlling interest in Montgomery Industries, the family estate at Lakewood Heights, my collection of antique automobiles, and liquid assets in the amount of $50 million. Michael nodded, solemnly, as though this massive inheritance was nothing more than his due. My mother dabbed at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, her emotional responses long ago dulled by prescribed chemical comforts. To my wife, Caroline Elizabeth Montgomery, I leave our properties in Aspen and Palm Beach, my personal investment, portfolio, and an annual stipend of $5 million for the remainder of her natural life. And then came the moment that would have been devastating had I not already secured my own position. To my daughter, Eleanor Jane Montgomery, who has consistently disappointed me with her lack of business acumen and financial responsibility, I leave the sum of $1,000. A hushed murmur rippled through the assembled family members and executives. Michael couldn't quite suppress a smirk, while my mother's vacant expression remained unchanged. I maintained a carefully neutral expression, even as Whitaker cleared his throat uncomfortably before continuing with various charitable bequests. As the gathering dispersed, Michael approached me with an expression of practiced sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "Eleanor, I know this must be difficult for you," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "If you need help with expenses, while you continue your little career in Seattle, I could arrange a modest stipend." I studied my brother's face, so like my father's, down to the calculating eyes and the smile that never quite seemed genuine. "That won't be necessary, Michael," I replied evenly. "I'm quite comfortable with my financial situation." "Still," he pressed, $1,000 is hardly a fitting inheritance for a Montgomery. Perhaps we could discuss some ceremonial position at the company, something suitable for your qualifications. I allowed myself a small smile. "I appreciate the concern, but I'll be just fine." I glanced at my watch. "If you'll excuse me, I have a conference call in 20 minutes regarding some investment matters." As I walked away, I heard him mutter to our mother, "Always playing at business. Father was right about her." Little did he know that in exactly 1 week, when Montgomery Industries held its quarterly board meeting, Athena Capital Partners would reveal its controlling interest and demand a seat at the table. My seat. Perhaps then Michael would finally understand the true cost of underestimating Eleanor Montgomery. The quarterly board meeting of Montgomery Industries was scheduled for exactly 7 days after the reading of my father's will. For decades, these meetings had followed the same predictable format. My father presiding with iron authority, board members offering token input, before inevitably agreeing with whatever direction Richard Montgomery deemed appropriate. Today, however, would mark the dawn of a new era. I arrived at Montgomery Tower 30 minutes early, dressed in a tailored navy suit that projected quiet authority. The security guard at the reception desk did a double take as I approached. "Miss Montgomery? We weren't expecting you today." I smiled politely. "I believe you'll find I'm expected at the board meeting, Frank." I slid a business card across the counter. Not my personal card with Meridian Capital's logo, but a new one bearing the embossed insignia of Athena Capital Partners. Frank's eyebrows rose as he made a quick call to the executive floor. After a brief, hushed conversation, he returned the receiver to its cradle and handed me a visitor badge with evident confusion. "The board is gathering in Conference Room A, Miss Montgomery. Mr. Whitaker requested that you wait in the adjacent lounge until you're announced." Bernard Whitaker, ever the skilled orchestrator of delicate situations, had insisted on managing today's revelation personally. His law firm had discovered my ownership position during standard pre-meeting verification procedures 3 days ago. The shock on his face during our subsequent private meeting had been worth every calculated move of the past 18 months. "Miss Montgomery," he had sputtered, leafing through the ownership documentation with trembling fingers. This indicates that Athena Capital Partners owns nearly 30% of Montgomery Industries' outstanding shares. 29.7%, to be precise, I had confirmed calmly. And you? You are the sole principal of Athena Capital? I am. But this makes you the largest individual shareholder in the company. Larger than your brother's position, even after your father's bequest. I had allowed myself a small smile. Yes, it does. Now, as I waited in the luxuriously appointed lounge adjacent to the boardroom, I could hear the muffled sounds of the meeting being called to order. Through the frosted glass doors, I could make out the silhouettes of board members taking their customary seats, the same seats they had occupied during my father's reign, never questioning, never challenging, merely rubber-stamping his unilateral decisions. My phone vibrated with a text from Valerie. Ready to make history? The Meridian team is behind you 100%. I texted back a simple thank you as Bernard Whitaker emerged from the boardroom, his expression a careful mask of professional neutrality. They're ready for you, Miss Montgomery, he said quietly. I've prepared them as best I could, but they're still in shock, I finished for him. That's to be expected. He nodded, adjusting his bow tie nervously. Your brother is displeased. I imagine he is. I stood, smoothing non-existent wrinkles from my suit. Shall we? Whitaker held the door open, and I entered the Montgomery Industries boardroom for the first time as a controlling stakeholder rather than an unwelcome interloper. 12 pairs of eyes swiveled toward me, expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. Michael sat at the head of the table, my father's chair, his knuckles white as he gripped the polished mahogany. What is the meaning of this? Eleanor? He demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. Whitaker says you're claiming to be some sort of major shareholder? This is preposterous. I took my time crossing to the empty seat directly opposite Michael, acutely aware of the power dynamics at play. This room had witnessed countless displays of Montgomery dominance over the years. Today would simply feature a different Montgomery than expected. It's not a claim, Michael, I replied evenly, nodding to Whitaker, who began distributing folders to each board member. As the documentation before you confirms, Athena Capital Partners has acquired a 29.7% ownership stake in Montgomery Industries through fully legitimate market transactions. As the sole principal of Athena, that position belongs to me. The board members, mostly my father's contemporaries, with a few younger executives who had risen through the ranks, leafed through the papers with expressions of increasing disbelief. Harold Dawson, who had served on the board since before I was born, was the first to find his voice. This is unprecedented, he stammered, looking between Michael and me as though watching a tennis match. The combined Montgomery family holdings have always maintained majority control. And they still do, I confirmed. Between my shares and those Michael inherited from our father, the Montgomery family retains firm control of the company. The difference is that control is now shared rather than singular. Michael slammed his palm against the table, causing several board members to flinch. This is some kind of trick, a ploy for attention. You've never shown the slightest interest in the company's operations. I met his gaze with a calm I had practiced for years. On the contrary, I've maintained a keen interest in Montgomery Industries throughout my career. I simply pursued that interest through channels our father couldn't control or dismiss. Miss Montgomery's ownership position is entirely legitimate, Whitaker interjected, his professional demeanor reasserting itself. I've had our team verify every transaction. The acquisitions were executed through standard market mechanisms over an 18-month period, primarily during periods of share price weakness. Michael's face flushed with rising anger. During our expansion challenges, when we were temporarily cash-strapped, you deliberately targeted us during a vulnerable period. I recognized an undervalued asset and invested accordingly, I corrected. Him. That's sound business strategy, Michael. Surely our father taught you that much. The implied criticism hung in the air. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Richard Montgomery had been notoriously ruthless in targeting vulnerable companies for acquisition. Hearing his tactics referenced in this context clearly struck a nerve. Furthermore, I continued, sliding my own folder across the table, I've prepared an analysis of Montgomery Industries' current market position and growth challenges, along with strategic recommendations for the next 3 quarters. The document represented hundreds of hours of research and analysis, drawing on both public information and insights gleaned from industry contacts I had cultivated at Meridian. I had dissected every facet of my father's company with clinical precision, identifying inefficiencies and opportunities that his outdated management approach had systematically overlooked. Gregory Vance, the company's chief financial officer, was the first to engage with the substance of my presentation. As he flipped through the pages, his initial skepticism gave way to reluctant interest. "These projections for the telecom division," he began, tracing a finger along one of my charts, "reflect the impact of emerging regional carriers on our legacy infrastructure revenue," I finished for him. Page 17 details a potential partnership strategy that would transform those challengers from threats to assets. Vance looked up, reassessing me with newfound respect. "This is remarkably thorough." Michael snatched the document from him, skimming it with increasing agitation. "This is meaningless theoretical posturing," he declared, tossing it aside. "Eleanor has never managed anything larger than her personal checking account. She has no practical experience in telecommunications or corporate governance." "Actually," I countered, "for the past 5 years, I've been managing investment portfolios worth billions at Meridian Capital, specializing in telecommunications and technology sector analysis. My recommended positions have outperformed industry benchmarks by an average of 22% annually." I turned to address the full board directly. "Gentlemen, I'm not here to stage a hostile takeover or disrupt the company my grandfather founded. I'm here because Montgomery Industries is at a critical inflection point. Our core business model is facing significant disruption. Our innovation pipeline has stagnated, and our market share is eroding in key segments." Several board members exchanged meaningful glances. These were not revelations, but confirmations of concerns that had been percolating beneath my father's authoritarian leadership. "As a significant shareholder," I continued, "I have both the right and the responsibility to ensure that the company adapts to these challenges. My analysis suggests that with strategic repositioning, Montgomery Industries could not only weather the current industry transformation, but emerge as a market leader in integrated communications infrastructure." Harold Dawson leaned forward, hands clasped before him. "What exactly are you proposing, Eleanor?" Before I could respond, Michael interrupted. "This is absurd. We're not seriously entertaining investment advice from someone who's been deliberately excluded from company operations for her entire life. There's a reason our father left her nothing but a token sum in his will." The reminder of my father's final insult was meant to diminish me in the eyes of the board. Instead, it strengthened my resolve. Our father made many sound business decisions during his tenure, I acknowledged, but his judgment regarding my capabilities was not among them. The investment position I've built in this company is testament to that fact. I turned back to Dawson. "To answer your question, Harold, I'm proposing a board seat commensurate with my ownership position and the formation of a strategic planning committee to evaluate the recommendations in my report." Michael barked a laugh entirely devoid of humor. "Absolutely not. The board composition is determined by the controlling interest, which remains with me." Bernard Whitaker cleared his throat delicately. "Actually, Mr. Montgomery, the corporate bylaws are quite specific on this matter. Any shareholder with a position exceeding 25% is entitled to proportional board representation. Miss Montgomery's request is well within her rights as a major stakeholder. The color drained from Michael's face as the full implications of my revelation began to settle. This wasn't merely about embarrassing him or seeking recognition. This was a fundamental shift in the power dynamics that had governed Montgomery Industries since its inception. There's another consideration, I added, my voice steady. The Madison acquisition that's currently being negotiated. Michael's eyes narrowed. How do you know about Madison? It's my business to know, I replied simply. The acquisition makes strategic sense, but your financing approach is flawed. The terms you've negotiated with Westlake Financial would saddle the company with excessive debt at punitive interest rates. Gregory Vance looked startled. Those negotiations are highly confidential. And yet the information is accessible. To those who know where to look, I countered. More importantly, there's a better way. Meridian Capital is prepared to offer financing at 3 points below Westlake's rate, with more flexible covenants and a longer commitment timeline. I slid another document onto the table, a preliminary term sheet bearing Valerie Torres's signature. This offer is contingent on board approval of my strategic recommendations, including the appointment of a new Chief Innovation Officer and a comprehensive review of our product development pipeline. The room fell silent as the magnitude of my preparation became clear. I hadn't just acquired shares. I had developed a comprehensive vision for the company's future and secured the resources to implement it. Michael pushed back from the table abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This meeting is adjourned until further notice. I need to consult with legal counsel regarding these developments. The meeting continues, I countered firmly. As a board member with significant ownership rights, I move that we vote on the Madison financing proposal today, as scheduled. Harold Dawson cleared his throat. I second the motion. Michael stared at his longtime ally in disbelief. Harold? Dawson had the grace to look uncomfortable, but he held firm. The Madison timeline doesn't allow for delays, Michael. If Miss Montgomery's financing option is viable, we have a fiduciary duty to consider it. One by one, the board members nodded in agreement. For perhaps the first time in company history, a Montgomery decree had been challenged and overruled. As the discussion proceeded, with Vance diving into the details of the competing financing proposals, I caught a glimpse of my brother's face. Beyond the anger and humiliation, I recognized something else. Fear. The absolute control he had expected to inherit was slipping through his fingers, and he had no idea how to function without it. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. Michael had been shaped by our father just as surely as I had been, molded into a replica of Richard Montgomery's worst qualities while being shielded from the necessity of developing his own judgment or resilience. But sympathy wouldn't build the company's future. By the meeting's end, the board had approved my financing proposal for the Madison acquisition, established a strategic planning committee with me as chair, and scheduled a special session to review my complete recommendations. As we gathered our materials, Harold Dawson approached me with an appraising look. Your father would be both furious and impressed, he observed quietly. You are a Montgomery after all, it seems. I smiled, thinking of the $1,000 check that represented my father's final assessment of my worth. I never needed his permission to be who I am, Harold. That was his mistake. Michael waited until the boardroom had emptied before confronting me, his voice low and dangerous. You think you've won some great victory here, don't you? Swooping in with your charts and financing, playing the corporate savior? This isn't about winning, Michael. It's about securing the company's future, our family's legacy. He stepped closer, invading my personal space in a familiar intimidation tactic. You have no idea what you've started. I am my father's son, Eleanor. I know how to fight, and I know how to win. I met his gaze without flinching. That's where you're wrong. Michael, you're fighting to preserve the past. I'm building the future. As I gathered my belongings and headed for the door, he called after me. He never would have accepted this, you know. No matter what you accomplished, you would always be a disappointment to him. I paused at the threshold, considering my response carefully. Perhaps, but I'm not doing this for his approval anymore. I outgrew that need while you were still desperately chasing it. The door closed behind me with a satisfying click, sealing off his response. As I walked through the executive corridor, past the portraits of Montgomery patriarchs that lined the walls, their stern faces watching with painted disapproval, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I was entering Montgomery Tower not as Richard's disappointing daughter, but as Eleanor Montgomery, strategist and investor, claiming my rightful place at the table through merit rather than inheritance. The company would never be the same, and neither would I. The revelation had landed, the shockwaves were spreading, and the real work of transformation was about to begin. Whatever challenges Michael might mount, whatever resistance the old guard might offer, I was prepared. I had been preparing my entire life, after all. They just hadn't been paying attention. News of the boardroom revelation spread through Montgomery, industries with the velocity of light through fiber optic cable. By morning, every employee from executive suite to mailroom knew that Eleanor Montgomery, the daughter Richard Montgomery had publicly dismissed, had returned as the company's largest individual shareholder. Corporate mythology was being rewritten in real time. I established a temporary office on the executive floor, 2 doors down from my brother's corner suite. The space had previously belonged to Warren Phillips, the retiring chief strategic officer whose position had been left intentionally vacant by my father. Strategic vision was a Montgomery prerogative, not a delegated responsibility. The symbolism of occupying this particular office wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Michael. Sophia Rivera, my newly appointed executive assistant recruited from Meridian Capital, organized the space with military precision. By 9 a.m., I had a fully functional command center from which to begin implementing the changes I had envisioned during my years of patient observation. The Strategic Planning Committee members have confirmed for the 2 p.m. meeting, Sophia informed, me placing a meticulously prepared agenda on my desk. Mr. Vance has requested a private meeting beforehand to discuss the Madison financing transition. Schedule him for 1:15, I replied, reviewing the latest market analysis on my tablet. And please arrange access to the complete project files for our telecom infrastructure modernization initiative. I understand they're housed on a separate server. Sophia nodded, making a note. Mr. Whitaker called. Your brother has requested an emergency shareholder meeting for next Monday. I looked up, unsurprised but intrigued. That was faster than expected. He's trying to rally the minority shareholders against me. Should I prepare a response? Not yet. Let's see what strategy he pursues. I returned to the quarterly projections I was reviewing, noting the concerning trajectory of the Legacy Services division. Also, please schedule a tour of the R&D facility for tomorrow. I want to see our innovation pipeline firsthand. As Sophia departed, a soft knock at my partially open door drew my attention. Gregory Vance stood in the threshold, his normally composed demeanor notably unsettled. Do you have a moment, Miss Montgomery? Or should I say Ms. Athena? His attempt at humor couldn't mask his discomfort. Eleanor is fine, Gregory. Please come in. I gestured to the chair opposite my desk. Our meeting isn't until this afternoon. This isn't about Madison. He closed the door behind him, lowering his voice. It's about your brother. I set aside my tablet, giving him my full attention. Go on. Michael has called an emergency finance meeting. He's directed me to freeze all discretionary spending and halt the capital expenditures approved last quarter, including the network upgrade projects. This was a predictable if short-sighted countermove. By constraining cash flow, Michael hoped to hamper my initiatives before they could gain momentum. On what grounds? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Strategic uncertainty, Vance quoted, his expression suggesting what he thought of that justification. He's claiming that your emergence as a major shareholder constitutes a material change requiring comprehensive financial reassessment. I leaned back in my chair, considering the implications. And what do you think, Gregory? You've been CFO for almost 15 years. Is this standard procedure? Vance shifted uncomfortably. No. It's an overreaction that could damage our operational capabilities. The network upgrades are critical. We're already losing market share to competitors with more advanced infrastructure. Which is precisely why I highlighted them in my strategic proposal, I noted. Michael knows this. He's deliberately targeting initiatives aligned with my vision. The CFO met my gaze directly. I've served this company loyally under your father's leadership. I respected him greatly, but... He hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. But you don't always agree with the Montgomery management approach. I finished for him. A slight nod. Richard was brilliant but inflexible. Michael inherited that inflexibility without the same brilliance to balance it. He straightened, seeming to have made a decision. I believe your infrastructure modernization plan is essential for the company's future. I cannot, in good conscience, support actions that undermine it. This was a significant development, a C-suite executive breaking ranks with Michael. What are you proposing, Gregory? The frozen projects were already approved in last quarter's budget. As CFO, I have some discretion regarding implementation timelines. I could designate certain elements as essential maintenance rather than discretionary upgrades, allowing work to continue while this situation resolves. I considered his offer carefully. Accepting would mean Vance was choosing sides in what was rapidly becoming a Montgomery civil war. That could put your position at risk. He smiled thinly. I've been preparing for retirement anyway. I'd rather leave knowing I acted in the company's best interests. I appreciate your integrity, Gregory, but let's not resort to bureaucratic maneuvering just yet. I opened my laptop, pulling up a document I had prepared in anticipation of exactly this scenario. The bylaws state that expenditure freezes affecting previously approved strategic initiatives require majority board approval, not just an executive directive. Vance's eyebrows rose. I wasn't aware of that specific provision. Few people are. It was added during the 1997 reorganization when my grandfather was concerned about potential interference from outside investors. I forwarded the relevant documentation to his email. If Michael wants to freeze these projects, he'll need to convince the board, and I'll be there to present the counterargument. Relief washed over his features. That's an elegant solution, less confrontational than my approach. Sometimes the most effective power moves are the ones firmly grounded in established protocol, I observed. My father taught me that much, albeit unintentionally. As Vance departed with renewed purpose, I turned my attention to the inevitable confrontation with Michael. He would be furious when his directive was challenged on procedural grounds, but that was precisely the point. Each overreach, each emotional reaction would further diminish his standing with the board and executive team. I didn't have to wait long. Less than an hour later, my office door flew open without the courtesy of a knock. Michael stormed in, face flushed with anger, startling Sophia, who had clearly tried to intercept him. I'm sorry, Ms. Montgomery, she stammered from the doorway. He wouldn't wait. It's all right, Sophia. I remained seated, deliberately calm in contrast to Michael's agitation. My brother and I are overdue for a conversation anyway. She retreated, closing the door behind her as Michael paced before my desk like a caged predator. Undermining my authority on your first day? He snarled. That didn't take long. Citing corporate bylaws is hardly undermining authority, I replied evenly. If you'd read them more carefully, you might have anticipated the response. He planted his hands on my desk, leaning forward in a posture meant to intimidate. This company has operated successfully for nearly 50 years. Under singular leadership, first grandfather then father. We don't govern by committee. And yet we have a board of directors and corporate bylaws that specify collective decision-making for certain matters. Curious contradiction, isn't it? Michael straightened, visibly struggling to control his temper. This isn't some academic exercise, Eleanor. This is the real world with real consequences. Your interference could damage relationships with clients and partners who expect stability, not corporate warfare. I agree completely, I said, surprising him. Which is why I've spent the morning personally calling our top 10 clients to reassure them that the transition will not affect their service quality or ongoing projects. His expression betrayed his shock. You had no right? Actually, I had every right. As a board member and major shareholder, maintaining client confidence falls squarely within my purview. I stood, eliminating the height advantage he had. Established. Those calls should have been your priority this morning, Michael, not freezing essential infrastructure investments out of spite. For a moment, genuine confusion flickered across his features. The concept that I might be making decisions based on business fundamentals rather than personal vendettas seemed to genuinely perplex him. This isn't about spite, he insisted, though his tone lacked conviction. It's about prudent management during a period of uncertainty. Then demonstrate that prudence by allowing the Strategic Planning Committee to conduct a proper review before making unilateral decisions. The network upgrades have already been delayed twice under Father's leadership. Further delays will only accelerate our market share erosion. Michael's eyes narrowed. Since when are you an expert on telecommunications? Infrastructure? Since I began specializing in the sector at Meridian 5 years ago. Our firm has guided investment strategies for 3 of the top regional carriers that are currently eating into our market share. I reached for a folder on my desk, extending it to him. These are the latest competitive analysis reports. I suggest you review them before the board meeting where you'll need to justify the expenditure freeze. He ignored the offered documents. You think you can just walk in here after years of absence and immediately understand the complexities of running this company? You've never managed anything close to this scale. Neither had you until a week ago, I pointed out. The difference is that I've spent years studying this industry from an analytical perspective, while you've been executing Father's directives without questioning their strategic foundations. That struck a nerve. Michael had always been sensitive about being viewed as merely our father's instrument rather than a strategic thinker in his own right. You have no idea what conversations occurred between Father and me, he retorted. We were building toward a comprehensive vision. A vision that hasn't been updated since before the smartphone revolution, I interrupted gently. The telecommunications landscape has fundamentally transformed, Michael. Our business model needs to evolve accordingly. He scoffed. And I suppose your magical, strategic plan solves all these challenges? It addresses the most pressing ones, yes. The board seemed to find it compelling enough to establish a committee for further evaluation. I paused, considering my next words carefully. You could contribute valuable operational insights to that committee if you chose to participate constructively. The olive branch was strategic, not sentimental. Michael needed an opportunity to save face, to participate in the inevitable changes rather than merely oppose them. His response was predictably dismissive. I don't need a seat at a table that's already stacked against me. The only thing stacked against you is your own resistance to necessary change, I replied, my patience waning. This company faces legitimate competitive challenges that won't disappear because you find them inconvenient to your leadership narrative. Leadership narrative? He echoed incredulously. This isn't about narrative. This is about protecting what Father built. No, Michael. It's about evolving what Grandfather built. Father was merely a steward, as are we. The difference is, that I recognize the responsibility that comes with that stewardship. He stepped back, reassessing me with cold calculation. You've rehearsed all this, haven't you? The concerned shareholder, the strategic visionary, riding to save the company from outdated leadership. His lip curled in disdain. It's an impressive performance. I wonder if the board would find it as compelling if they knew about your attempt to secure financing for a hostile takeover last year. The accusation caught me off guard. Not because it was true, but because it was so specifically fabricated. What are you talking about? Michael's expression shifted to one of smug satisfaction. Didn't think I'd find out about your meetings with Blackwood Partners? They're not known for minority investment positions, Eleanor. They specialize in takeovers. I maintained my composure, though my mind raced to identify the source of this misinformation. I had never met with Blackwood Partners. This was a deliberate falsehood, but why this particular lie? I've never had any contact with Blackwood Partners, I stated firmly. If you've received information suggesting otherwise, it's incorrect. Deny it all you want. I have documentation, meeting dates, attendees, even preliminary term sheets. He smiled with malicious confidence. The board might reconsider your sudden interest in corporate governance if they realized you tried to orchestrate a complete takeover before resorting to your current approach. Understanding dawned. This wasn't just a desperate countermove, it was a calculated strategy. Michael was attempting to undermine my credibility by fabricating evidence of hostile intent. The approach was sophisticated enough to suggest he wasn't working alone. Falsifying corporate records is a serious offense, Michael, I said quietly. One with potential criminal implications. His confident expression didn't waver. Proving falsification would be difficult, especially given Blackwood's reluctance to discuss failed negotiations. Their confidentiality agreements are notoriously rigid. The scheme was clever in its simplicity. Blackwood would naturally deny any negotiations if approached directly, which would appear to confirm their strict confidentiality rather than the absence of meetings. Is this really how you want to proceed? I asked, studying him carefully. With fabricated allegations instead of addressing the legitimate business challenges facing the company? I'm simply protecting Montgomery Industries from a threat, exactly as Father would have done. Michael straightened his tie, regaining his composure. The emergency shareholder meeting will proceed on Monday. I suggest you prepare accordingly. As he turned to leave, I called after him. Michael. He paused at the door. Before you distribute any documentation regarding Blackwood Partners, you should know that I maintain comprehensive records of my professional activities, including my complete calendar and communications for the past 5 years. His shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. Furthermore, I continued, I've never traveled to Chicago, where Blackwood is headquartered, during the time frame you're likely to claim these meetings occurred. My passport records, credit card statements, and phone GPS data would all confirm that fact. Michael turned slowly, reassessing the scenario with visible calculation. False allegations won't strengthen your position, I concluded. They'll only damage your credibility when disproven, and they will be disproven. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his face. Then the mask of Montgomery confidence returned. We'll see what evidence proves most compelling. Enjoy. Your temporary position, Eleanor. It won't last. After he departed, I sat quietly, processing the encounter. Michael's willingness to fabricate evidence indicated a desperation I hadn't anticipated at this stage. More concerning was the sophistication of the approach, which suggested external advisement. Someone was guiding his counteroffensive, someone who understood corporate power plays at a level Michael himself did not. My phone buzzed with a text from Bernard Whitaker. Need to speak urgently regarding Morgan Stanley call. Available now? I frowned. I hadn't scheduled any call with Morgan Stanley. This was Whitaker's discreet way of indicating sensitive information that shouldn't be put in writing. "Send him in," I told Sophia through the intercom. Whitaker arrived moments later, his normally impeccable appearance slightly disheveled. He closed the door firmly before speaking. "Your brother has retained Donovan Walsh," he said without preamble. The name explained everything. Donovan Walsh was a notorious corporate mercenary, officially a strategic consultant, but in reality a specialist in boardroom coups and shareholder manipulation. He operated in the shadows of corporate America, engineering the removal of executives and the restructuring of boards through methods that skirted the boundaries of legality without quite crossing them. "The Blackwood Partners accusation," I murmured. "That's straight from Walsh's playbook." Whitaker nodded grimly. "He orchestrated a similar scenario during the Westridge media dispute last year. False meeting records, fabricated communications, a carefully constructed narrative of hostile intent. How did Michael even connect with someone like Walsh? That's not his typical network." "I suspect through Reynolds," Whitaker replied, referencing Thomas Reynolds, a board member with connections throughout the business world. Reynolds and Walsh have history. They worked together on the Continental Resources restructuring. I processed this information, recalibrating my assessment of the situation. Walsh's involvement elevated the threat considerably. He was ruthless, methodical, and experienced in exactly this type of shareholder conflict. "What's our exposure?" I asked. "Considerable," Whitaker admitted. "Walsh doesn't enter a conflict unless he sees a clear path to victory. He'll have identified vulnerabilities in your position that we may not have recognized." I thought of the careful, systematic way I had built my ownership stake, the meticulous documentation of every transaction. My acquisition of Montgomery shares was entirely legitimate. Every transaction is fully documented and compliant with securities regulations. "Walsh won't attack the legitimacy of your share ownership," Whitaker cautioned. "He'll focus on undermining your credibility with the board and other shareholders. The Blackwood accusation is just the opening move." I considered the implications. "He'll construct a narrative painting me as a hostile actor, attempting a revenge-motivated takeover." "Precisely. And he'll build that narrative using a mixture of facts, half-truths, and fabrications calibrated to seem plausible to those who don't know you personally." Whitaker hesitated, then added, "The $1,000 bequest in your father's will plays perfectly into this narrative. Walsh will position it as evidence that Richard recognized your hostile intentions." The irony wasn't lost on me. My father's final insult was being weaponized to protect his outdated vision for the company. "We need to get ahead of this," I decided. "The emergency shareholder meeting on Monday is Walsh's stage. He'll use it to introduce the false narrative before we can establish credibility with the minority shareholders." Whitaker nodded in agreement. "What's your counter-strategy?" I smiled, a plan already forming. "Walsh expects us to play defense, to deny the allegations and attempt to discredit them after they're introduced. Instead, we're going to change the battlefield entirely." I outlined my approach, watching Whitaker's expression shift from concern to cautious optimism. "It's aggressive," he observed when I finished. "Richard would never have approved." "My father's approval is no longer relevant," I replied evenly. "His management philosophy is what put the company in its current vulnerable position." Whitaker studied me with newfound respect. "You truly are a Montgomery, Eleanor, though perhaps a new breed entirely." "That's precisely the point, Bernard. Montgomery Industries doesn't need another Richard Montgomery. It needs leadership adapted for the challenges ahead, not the battles of the past." As Whitaker departed to set our counter-strategy in motion, I turned to the window, gazing across the city skyline. Somewhere in that urban landscape, Donovan Walsh was constructing a narrative designed to destroy my credibility and preserve the status quo that Richard Montgomery had established. He was operating on a fundamental misunderstanding. This wasn't about revenge or vindication. It wasn't even about proving my father wrong. It was about transforming a company with tremendous potential from a declining legacy business into a forward-looking enterprise. Michael, Walsh, and their allies were fighting to preserve my father's final judgment, that $1,000 bequest that declared me unworthy of the Montgomery legacy. They didn't realize that in doing so, they were proving exactly why that judgment needed to be overturned. By Monday morning, they would understand their miscalculation. The board meeting wouldn't be a referendum on Eleanor Montgomery's credibility. It would be a decisive battle for the company's future. And unlike my brother, I had spent years preparing for this moment. As Sophia returned with the R&D division reports I had requested, I turned away from the window with renewed focus. Walsh was a formidable opponent, but he had one critical vulnerability. He was fighting for the past while I was building the future. In corporate warfare, just as in investment strategy, the advantage always belongs to those who can see beyond the immediate horizon. Friday evening found me not at home, but in a secure conference room at Meridian Capital's Seattle office, surrounded by financial records, corporate filings, and dossiers on key Montgomery Industries shareholders. Valerie Torres sat across from me, her sleeves rolled up and her customary elegance softened by the late hour and the gravity of our task. "Walsh is methodical," she observed, reviewing the information we had gathered on my new adversary. In the Westridge media conflict, he spent weeks building relationships with minority shareholders before making his move. He positions himself as the voice of reason amidst chaos. "We don't have weeks," I replied, studying the ownership breakdown of Montgomery shares. "The emergency meeting is Monday morning. Whatever groundwork Walsh has laid, it's already in place." My phone buzzed with a message from Sophia, who had spent the day discreetly gathering intelligence from within Montgomery Tower. Walsh met with Reynolds and 3 other board members at Lakeside Club, private dining room, 3 hours. I forwarded the message to Valerie. "He's consolidating support. 4 board members plus Michael gives them 5 votes, she calculated. You need 7 for majority control. Dawson is with me, I confirmed. Vance isn't a board member but has significant influence. That still leaves us short." Valerie tapped her pen against the table, considering the situation. "We need to understand exactly what narrative Walsh is constructing. Without that, we're defending against shadows." "There might be a way," I said slowly, an idea forming. "Reynolds has a reputation for indiscretion after a few drinks, and he's scheduled to attend the Hammett Foundation Gala tomorrow night." Valerie raised an eyebrow. "You want to extract information at a charity event?" "Not me personally. Reynolds knows me too well now." I reached for my phone, scrolling through contacts. But he's never met Rachel Morrison. Rachel was Meridian's client relations director, sharp, personable, and capable of extracting information while appearing to share nothing of value herself. More importantly, she had once worked in corporate intelligence gathering before joining Meridian. "A bit unorthodox," Valerie remarked with a hint of admiration. "Richard Montgomery would never have approved of such tactics." "My father's approach was always frontal assault," I agreed. "He believed overwhelming force was the only strategy worth employing. It made him predictable." After arranging Rachel's attendance at the gala, I returned to analyzing the shareholder registry. Beyond the board members and family holdings, Montgomery Industries had 3 significant institutional investors and about 24 smaller shareholders, mostly longtime business associates and early employees who had accumulated equity over decades of service. "The institutional investors are key," I noted. "Together, they control nearly 20%. If Walsh convinces them to side with Michael, we'll be fighting an uphill battle." "What's their investment thesis?" Valerie asked. "Why do they hold Montgomery stock?" "Legacy positioning in telecommunications infrastructure," I replied. "But they've been reducing their holdings gradually over the past 3 years as our growth has stagnated." Valerie leaned forward, eyes gleaming with strategic insight. That's our angle. They're not emotionally invested in Montgomery leadership. They want return on investment. If your modernization plan offers better prospects than the status quo. We need to reach them before Walsh does, I concluded, already mentally drafting the approach. My phone buzzed again. Bernard Whitaker this time. Confidential source confirms Walsh accessing internal communications. Exercise extreme caution in all company systems. The message confirmed my suspicions. Walsh had already compromised Montgomery's internal networks, likely through allies in the IT department. Any strategic discussions conducted through company channels were potentially exposed. We need a secure communication protocol, I decided, and we need to identify the leak in Montgomery systems. Valerie nodded grimly. I'll have our security team set up an encrypted workspace. Nothing related to our strategy touches Montgomery networks from this point forward. As we established new operational security measures, I reflected on how quickly the situation had escalated from a boardroom power play to full-blown corporate espionage. Walsh's involvement had transformed what Michael intended as a simple intimidation campaign into something far more sophisticated and dangerous. By midnight, we had established a comprehensive picture of the battlefield and the forces aligned against us. Walsh had been thorough, approaching key stakeholders with a carefully crafted narrative that positioned me as an embittered outsider, attempting a hostile takeover motivated by personal vendettas rather than business sense. There's something else, Valerie said, reviewing financial records with a furrowed brow. The Madison acquisition timeline seems accelerated compared to standard industry practice. I looked up sharply. How so? The exclusivity agreement expires Monday afternoon, just hours after your emergency shareholder meeting. She turned her laptop to show me the filing. That's not coincidental timing. The implications were immediately clear. If Michael can maintain control through the shareholder meeting, he can finalize the Madison deal using Westlake's financing terms before I can formally object. And once the deal is closed with those terms, unwinding it would be prohibitively expensive, Valerie concluded. You'd be locked into a disadvantageous financing structure that would hamper your modernization initiatives for years. This explained the rushed timeline for the emergency meeting. It wasn't just about challenging my authority. It was about cementing financial commitments that would constrain my influence regardless of my ownership position. Walsh is cleverer than I gave him credit for, I admitted. He's using the Madison deal as both shield and weapon. So what's our countermove? Valerie asked. I considered our options, the pieces rearranging themselves in my mind. We need to separate the Madison acquisition from the leadership question. If we can demonstrate that my financing approach is objectively superior regardless of who's in charge, we undermine the urgency of their timeline. How do we do that when they've deliberately entangled the issues? By bringing Madison leadership directly into the conversation, I decided. Their CEO, Philip Norwood, has no loyalty to either faction at Montgomery. He just wants the best deal for his shareholders. You think he'd intervene in an internal Montgomery dispute? Not directly, I clarified. But if presented with a superior financing option that might be jeopardized by internal politics, he has a fiduciary duty to at least consider delaying the exclusivity deadline. It was a bold strategy, reaching outside our own corporate structure to neutralize an internal threat. My father would have considered it heretical. Corporate matters stayed within corporate walls. That was the Montgomery way. But the Montgomery way had led us to this precarious position in the first place. I'll reach out to Norwood first thing tomorrow, I decided. If we can secure even a 48-hour extension on the exclusivity agreement, it neutralizes the immediate threat. Valerie nodded approvingly. That buys time to address the shareholder concerns properly, without the artificial pressure of the Madison deadline. As we worked into the early morning hours refining our approach, my phone rang, an unfamiliar number with a Chicago area code. Curious, I answered on speaker. Eleanor Montgomery. My voice betrayed none of the exhaustion I felt after hours of strategic planning. "Ms. Montgomery," came a smooth male voice. "Donovan Walsh. I hope I'm not calling too late." I exchanged a startled glance with Valerie. The audacity of a direct approach was unexpected. "Mr. Walsh, this is certainly a surprise." "I believe in direct communication when possible," he replied, his tone pleasant and professional. "It eliminates unnecessary misunderstandings." "And what misunderstanding would you like to eliminate at—" I checked my watch. 2:17 in the morning? "The nature of our respective positions," he said simply. "Contrary to what you might believe, I have no personal stake in Montgomery Industries' leadership structure. I'm merely providing expertise to ensure an orderly transition during a period of potential instability." His framing was masterful, positioning himself as a neutral professional rather than Michael's hired gun. "That's a creative interpretation of your role in manufacturing the Blackwood Partners allegations." A soft chuckle. "A preliminary assessment of stakeholder responses to potential scenarios. Nothing more." "Fabricated scenarios," I corrected. "Details," he dismissed. "The larger point, Ms. Montgomery, is that this conflict need not become unnecessarily adversarial or public. I've reviewed your strategic proposals. They have merit, though the implementation timeline is unrealistically aggressive." The subtle shift in his approach was revealing. Walsh wasn't calling to threaten or intimidate. He was calling to negotiate. "I'm listening." "A compromise position," he proposed smoothly. "You maintain your board seat and strategic planning committee chairmanship. Michael remains CEO with final operational authority. Your modernization initiatives are implemented over a 5-year timeline rather than the proposed 2 years, allowing for more gradual adaptation of existing business units." Valerie scribbled a note and slid it across the table. Stalling tactic. She was right. The extended timeline would effectively neutralize the impact of my proposals while appearing to incorporate them. It was a classic corporate pacification strategy. Acknowledge the dissenting voice while removing its teeth. "And the Madison acquisition?" I asked, curious how he would address the most immediate point of contention. "Proceeds as scheduled with the current financing structure," Walsh replied without hesitation. "The terms are already negotiated and the timeline established. Disrupting that process creates unnecessary market uncertainty. The current financing terms are punitive and restrictive," I countered. "They would hamper growth initiatives for years." "Every financing arrangement involves trade-offs, Ms. Montgomery. The Westlake terms prioritize certainty over flexibility, which has its own value in turbulent markets." This was Walsh at his most effective, reasonable, knowledgeable, seemingly open to compromise while conceding nothing of substance. I could see why he had built such a formidable reputation in corporate dispute resolution. "An interesting proposal," I replied noncommittally. "Though I'm curious why you're presenting it rather than my brother." "Michael understands the value of professional mediation in sensitive situations," Walsh answered smoothly. "My objective perspective helps separate personal history from business considerations." "And does your objective perspective extend to reviewing the comparative financing terms I've secured through Meridian Capital?" I asked. "Terms that would save the company approximately $43 million in interest payments over the life of the acquisition loan?" A brief pause, the first crack in his polished demeanor. "I'd be happy to review any proposal that benefits Montgomery Industries. Send the terms to my office and I'll evaluate them objectively." "I think I'd prefer to present them directly to the board and shareholders on Monday," I replied. "In the interest of transparency." "As you wish." His tone remained pleasant, but the strategic retreat was evident. My offer of a negotiated compromise remains open until the meeting. Corporate conflicts of this nature rarely benefit either party when they escalate to formal shareholder votes. "I appreciate the counsel, Mr. Walsh, though I'm curious Have you shared this same wisdom with my brother? Corporate conflicts also rarely benefit either party when one side fabricates allegations against the other. All strategies are provisional until implemented, he replied cryptically. Final approaches are determined by the responses they generate. Your response has been educational. Glad I could contribute to your professional development, I said dryly. Likewise, Ms. Montgomery, you're not what I expected based on your file. That makes this situation considerably more interesting. There was a new note in his voice, a hint of genuine curiosity beneath the professional facade. I look forward to Monday's meeting. After the call ended, Valerie stared at me in disbelief. He's taking your measure, testing for weaknesses, and revealing his own approach in the process, I noted. He's used to intimidating or co-opting his opposition. When that failed, he shifted immediately to negotiation. Which means he's not fully confident in Michael's position, Valerie concluded. Exactly. If Walsh believed they had the vote secured for Monday, he wouldn't have bothered with a compromise offer. I leaned back, processing this new information. His call confirms what we suspected. They're still working to convince key shareholders. And now he knows you have alternative financing terms for Madison, Valerie pointed out. He'll adjust his strategy accordingly. Let him, I replied with newfound confidence. Every adjustment creates new vulnerabilities. The direct contact from Walsh had inadvertently revealed the most important insight of all. Despite his reputation and resources, he wasn't infallible. He had made a tactical error by calling personally, betraying uncertainty that contradicted his confident facade. For the first time since discovering Michael had retained Walsh, I felt the balance shifting in our favor. The corporate mercenary might have experience and connections, but he was operating with incomplete information about my capabilities and determination. By morning, Rachel had confirmed her attendance at the Hammett Foundation Gala, our securer. Communication protocols were established, and I had drafted preliminary outreach to Philip Norwood of Madison Technologies. The pieces were moving into place for Monday's confrontation. As I finally left Meridian's offices at dawn, exhausted but focused, I found myself thinking of my father. Richard Montgomery had built his empire through force of will and uncompromising vision. He had succeeded despite his blind spots and biases, or perhaps because he never acknowledged them as weaknesses. I was forging a different path, one that recognized the value of diverse perspectives and collaborative strength. Walsh and Michael were fighting to preserve my father's legacy using his own tactics: intimidation, manipulation, rigid control. They didn't understand that the business landscape had evolved beyond those approaches. In challenging me, they had inadvertently created the perfect opportunity to demonstrate precisely why Montgomery Industries needed new leadership for a new era. Monday's meeting wouldn't just determine who controlled the company, it would determine how the company operated for generations to come. As the first light of day broke over Seattle's skyline, I felt a surprising sense of gratitude toward Walsh. His intervention had clarified what was truly at stake. Not just my position or Michael's authority, but the fundamental nature of Montgomery Industries itself. The battle lines were drawn, the strategies were in motion. And unlike my father, who had discounted my abilities until his dying day, my opponents were about to discover exactly what Eleanor Montgomery was capable of achieving. Saturday morning arrived with a clarity that only comes after pivotal realizations. I had managed 3 hours of sleep before waking with a fully formed strategy in mind, the kind of comprehensive vision that doesn't emerge from conscious planning, but from allowing disparate elements to arrange themselves while the analytical mind rests. The Hammett Foundation Gala wouldn't begin until 8 that evening, giving me the day to set other critical elements in motion. My first call was to Philip Norwood, CEO of Madison Technologies. His assistant initially attempted to deflect, citing weekend family commitments, but relented when I mentioned specific details about the financing terms being offered by Montgomery Industries through Westlake Financial. Mr. Norwood will speak with you for 15 minutes, she conceded. Please hold. Norwood's voice was guarded when he came on the line. Ms. Montgomery, this is unexpected. Thank you for taking my call, Mr. Norwood. I'll be direct. I'm aware that the exclusivity agreement for Montgomery's acquisition of Madison expires Monday afternoon. A careful pause. That's correct. Though I'm curious how the timing of our corporate agreements became your personal concern. As Montgomery Industries' largest individual shareholder and a member of the board, all aspects of the Madison acquisition fall within my purview, I replied, particularly when the financing structure may not serve the best interests of either company. The terms were negotiated and approved by Richard Montgomery himself, Norwood countered, a note of defensiveness entering his voice. Your brother has assured us that the transition will proceed as planned. My father approved preliminary discussions, but the specific financing terms were finalized after his death, I corrected. And while I have no objection to the acquisition itself, the capital structure arranged through Westlake Financial imposes unnecessary constraints on both organizations. Norwood's tone shifted from defensive to cautiously curious. What exactly are you suggesting, Ms. Montgomery? I've secured alternative financing through Meridian Capital at terms significantly more favorable than the Westlake package. 3 points lower interest rate, reduced collateral requirements, and covenant structures that preserve operational flexibility for both entities during integration. That's a substantial improvement, Norwood admitted. But we're days away from closing. Changing financing arrangements now would require extending the exclusivity period. By 48 hours, I specified, a modest delay in exchange for terms that would save approximately $43 million over the life of the acquisition loan. The calculation hung in the air between us. For a finance-oriented CEO like Norwood, the numbers spoke with undeniable eloquence. I'd need to review the specifics, he said finally. Of course, I'll have them sent to you within the hour. I paused, carefully selecting my next words. Mr. Norwood, I should note that there's currently some debate within Montgomery leadership regarding strategic direction. My brother has called an emergency shareholder meeting for Monday morning. I've heard rumors, he acknowledged cautiously. Corporate governance matters are your concern, not mine. They become your concern when they potentially impact the acquisition, I pointed out. If you extend the exclusivity period by 48 hours, it allows both the leadership questions and the financing options to be evaluated on their respective merits, rather than as artificially linked decisions. Norwood was silent for several moments, calculating implications. You're suggesting that your brother is rushing to close under the current terms specifically to prevent consideration of your alternative financing. I'm merely noting that a brief extension serves everyone's interests by ensuring decisions are made deliberately rather than under arbitrary time pressure. Another pause, longer this time. Send the Meridian terms. I'll review them personally and discuss the exclusivity extension with my board. That's all I ask, I replied. Thank you for your consideration, Mr. Norwood. As I ended the call, Sophia entered with a secure tablet containing the morning's intelligence briefing. We had established a rotation of trusted personnel monitoring developments at Montgomery Tower even on weekends. Reynolds met with 3 institutional investors last night after leaving the Walsh meeting, she reported. Blackwood Partners was mentioned by name, according to our source in investor relations. They're constructing a narrative. As expected, I noted, scanning the report. What about Madison? Legal team worked through the night finalizing documentation. They're proceeding as if Monday's closing is certain. I smiled slightly. That may change shortly. Norwood is considering an exclusivity extension. Sophia raised an eyebrow, impressed. That would undermine their entire timeline strategy. Precisely. Walsh is attempting to force a decision point where shareholders must choose between stable leadership and uncertain financing. By separating ththose issues, we change the dynamic entirely. I scrolled through the remaining intelligence. What's happening with the network upgrade projects? Michael's freeze directive has been officially challenged on procedural grounds. The board secretary has scheduled a special review session for Monday after the shareholder meeting. Sophia hesitated. There's something else. IT security detected. Unauthorized access to your company email dating back 3 months. This was a significant revelation. 3 months? That predates my return to Montgomery Industries. Yes, someone has been monitoring your communications since before your father's death. The timeline implied something more complex than Walsh's recent involvement. This wasn't Michael acting alone, I murmured. Someone else has been watching me. The possibilities arranged themselves in my mind. Perhaps my father himself had authorized surveillance, suspicious of my separate career path. Or perhaps someone else within the Montgomery orbit had recognized my potential threat to the status quo long before I made my move. Have it trace the access points, I instructed. But maintain absolute discretion. If someone's been watching that long, they likely have allies throughout the organization. As Sophia departed to relay the directive, I turned my attention to the next phase of our strategy. The institutional investors Walsh and Reynolds had approached controlled nearly 20% of Montgomery shares, potentially enough to tip the balance in Monday's vote if combined with the board members already aligned with Michael. I needed to neutralize that support before the meeting. With Walsh constructing a narrative around the fabricated Blackwood Partners allegations, I needed a countermeasure that would demolish the credibility of those claims before they could take root. The answer came in the form of an unexpected ally. My secure phone chimed with a message from an unfamiliar number. This is Catherine Woodrow, Blackwood Partners GC. Understand my firm is being referenced in Montgomery's situation. Need to discuss urgently. Catherine Woodrow, Blackwood's general counsel, reaching out directly was an unforeseen development. The legitimate firm was apparently aware that their name was being used in Walsh's fabricated narrative and was moving to protect their reputation. Our subsequent call was brief and mutually beneficial. Woodrow confirmed that Blackwood Partners had never engaged in any discussions with me or any entity I controlled regarding Montgomery Industries. More importantly, she agreed to provide a formal letter stating this fact, addressed to the Montgomery board and shareholders. Blackwood doesn't appreciate being involuntarily drafted into corporate disputes, she noted dryly, particularly when it involves falsified meeting records. I appreciate your firm's prompt response to this situation, I replied. The letter will help clarify matters considerably. With Woodrow's commitment secured, another piece fell into place. Walsh's fabricated allegations would collapse under direct refutation from the very firm he had chosen to feature in his narrative. The development was significant enough to warrant updating Valerie immediately. This fundamentally changes the dynamic for Monday, she agreed when I called. With Blackwood denouncing the allegations and Norwood potentially extending the exclusivity, Walsh's entire strategy is compromised. Not entirely, I cautioned. He's adaptable. He'll pivot to new angles of attack. But he'll be reacting rather than executing his prepared strategy, Valerie pointed out. That puts you in the driver's seat. She was right. The momentum was shifting, creating an opening for the most critical phase of my plan. It's time to activate the final component, I decided. Schedule the media briefing for tomorrow afternoon. Are you sure? Valerie questioned. Going public changes everything. That's precisely the point, I replied. Walsh and Michael are fighting a shadow war of allegations and procedural maneuvers. Taking the substantive issues directly to the public creates a transparency they can't match. The media strategy represented my most significant departure from traditional Montgomery approaches. Richard had cultivated relationships with business journalists, but always controlled the narrative tightly, releasing information only when it served specific strategic purposes. The idea of proactively engaging financial media to outline a corporate vision during a leadership dispute would have been anathema to him. But the telecommunications landscape had changed dramatically. Investor confidence now depended on clear articulation of forward-looking strategies, not just historical performance. By outlining my modernization vision directly to influential industry analysts, I could reshape the conversation around Monday's shareholder meeting from a personality-driven power struggle to a substantive choice between competing business philosophies. As I drafted talking points for the media briefing, Rachel called from the Hammett Foundation Gala. "Reynolds is here," she reported. 3 glasses of scotch in and getting expansive about corporate strategy with anyone who'll listen. "What's he saying?" I asked. "Mostly vague comments about steady leadership and Montgomery traditions," she replied. "But he mentioned something interesting. Apparently Walsh has prepared dossiers on each major shareholder, identifying personal pressure points for individual approaches." "Classic Walsh methodology," I noted. "Any specifics?" "One that caught my attention. Reynolds mentioned that Walsh is particularly focused on Andrew Caldwell, says he's the most vulnerable of the institutional investors because his fund is underperforming and he can't afford any market volatility in major holdings. Andrew Caldwell managed the Northern Trust position in Montgomery Industries, approximately 7% of outstanding shares. If Walsh was targeting him specifically, it suggested Caldwell was seen as a potential swing vote. Did Reynolds indicate what approach they're taking with Caldwell? "Something about leveraging his relationship with Montgomery dating back to your grandfather's era," Rachel reported. "Apparently, he and your father were classmates at Dartmouth." This was valuable intelligence. Walsh was appealing to Caldwell's loyalty to the Montgomery legacy, a sentimental approach that ignored the financial imperatives driving institutional investment decisions. "Thank you, Rachel. Keep listening, but don't push too hard. Reynolds shouldn't suspect he's being pumped for information." After ending the call, I immediately reached out to Valerie. "We need to prepare a separate presentation for Andrew Caldwell," I explained. "Something that addresses both the business case for modernization and the connection to Montgomery's historical innovation legacy. Framing your approach as a return to core values rather than a departure from tradition," Valerie suggested, immediately grasping the strategy. "Exactly. Walsh is positioning this as loyalty to Richard versus supporting an outsider. We need to reframe it as choosing between stagnation and revitalization of the true Montgomery vision." By late evening, all the elements were falling into place. Norwood had tentatively agreed to a 48-hour extension of the Madison exclusivity period, contingent on formal presentation of the Meridian financing terms. Catherine Woodrow had delivered the Blackwood Partners letter categorically, denying any interactions with me or my investment vehicles. The media briefing was scheduled for Sunday afternoon, with key financial journalists already expressing keen interest in the rare opportunity to cover an internal Montgomery strategic discussion. Most importantly, I had scheduled a private breakfast with Andrew Caldwell for Sunday morning, bypassing Walsh's carefully orchestrated approach through Reynolds. The direct engagement would allow me to present my case personally, addressing both the business fundamentals and the legacy considerations that Walsh was attempting to leverage against me. As midnight approached, I stood at the window of my Seattle apartment, gazing across the city lights toward the illuminated Montgomery Tower in the distance. For decades, that building had symbolized my exclusion, a physical manifestation of the corporate realm my father had decreed was beyond my capability to understand or influence. Now it represented something entirely different, the visible embodiment of a legacy I was fighting not to destroy but to transform. The distinction was crucial, and it would be the centerpiece of my approach in the coming days. This wasn't just about proving my father wrong or asserting control over Michael. It was about ensuring that Montgomery Industries could evolve beyond the limitations Richard had imposed through his rigid adherence to outdated business models and leadership approaches. The $1,000 bequest in his will hadn't just been a final insult, it had been his last expression of a fundamentally flawed understanding of business leadership in the modern age. By dismissing diverse perspectives and collaborative approaches, Richard had unconsciously steered Montgomery Industries toward gradual decline, even as he believed he was preserving its strength. The emergency shareholder meeting on Monday was no longer a threat to be countered, but an opportunity to be seized, a platform from which to articulate a new vision, not just for Montgomery Industries, but for the very concept of corporate leadership itself. In that moment, standing between the city lights and the tower that bore my family name, I felt a profound shift in my own perspective. I was no longer fighting against my father's judgment or my brother's resistance. I was fighting for something larger than personal vindication, the future of an enterprise that employed thousands and served millions. The turning point had arrived. Whatever challenges Walsh and Michael might still present, the fundamental dynamic had changed. I was no longer reacting to their maneuvers. They would be responding to mine. Sunday would bring the public articulation of my vision. Monday would determine whether that vision would guide Montgomery Industries into its next chapter. But regardless of the outcome, I had already achieved something my father had never believed possible. I had forced the company he built to confront the future he had refused to see. Sunday dawned with the quiet intensity that precedes decisive action. After a brief meditation to clear my mind, I prepared for my breakfast meeting with Andrew Caldwell at the Wellington Club, an old money establishment where my grandfather had once held court among Seattle's business elite. The venue was deliberate, a subtle reminder of Montgomery Industries' heritage beyond my father's tenure. Caldwell arrived precisely on time, a trim man in his 60s with the careful dress and watchful eyes of someone who managed billions in other people's money. His handshake was firm, his expression guarded. "Ms. Montgomery," he greeted me as we were seated in a private dining alcove. "This is an unexpected invitation." "I appreciate you making time, Mr. Caldwell. I understand you have history with Montgomery Industries dating back to my grandfather's era." A careful nod. "Your grandfather was a visionary. Your father continued his legacy admirably." I noted his phrasing, diplomatic acknowledgement without personal endorsement. My grandfather built Montgomery Industries by anticipating technological shifts before his competitors recognized them, I observed. He transformed a regional telephone company into a telecommunications infrastructure leader by betting on fiber optics when others were still investing in copper. Caldwell's expression softened slightly. William Montgomery could see around corners. He positioned the company for decades of growth through that single strategic pivot. While my father excelled at optimization and market consolidation, I continued, but made few substantive investments in emerging technologies during his tenure. Caldwell studied me carefully. "That's a rather critical assessment of Richard's leadership." "It's an objective one," I countered, sliding a folder across the table. "These are the R&D investment figures as a percentage of revenue for the past 20 years compared to industry benchmarks. Under my grandfather, Montgomery consistently led the industry. Under my father, we gradually declined to the bottom quartile." As Caldwell reviewed the data, I continued, "My modernization strategy isn't a rejection of Montgomery traditions, Mr. Caldwell. It's a return to our foundational approach, identifying technological inflection points and positioning the company to capitalize on them before competitors can react." Caldwell looked up from the figures, reassessing me with newfound interest. "Your brother and his advisors paint a different picture. They suggest you're seeking to dismantle established business units in favor of speculative ventures." A convenient mischaracterization," I replied evenly. "I've never advocated dismantling proven revenue streams. My strategy focuses on revitalizing our innovation pipeline while optimizing existing operations, much as my grandfather did during the transition from copper to fiber." I presented him with a second document, a detailed comparison of modernization approaches. including timeline projections, capital requirements, and anticipated market impacts. The analysis was meticulous, supported by industry data and competitor benchmarking. "This is considerably more detailed than what Reynolds shared yesterday," Caldwell remarked, clearly impressed despite himself. "Thomas Reynolds doesn't have access to my complete strategic assessment," I explained. "What you're seeing is the result of 5 years analyzing telecommunications infrastructure trends at Meridian Capital, applied specifically to Montgomery's market position." Caldwell studied the projections with the practiced eye of an investment veteran. "These growth estimates seem ambitious. They're predicated on positioning Montgomery at the forefront of 3 converging trends. I outlined the technological shifts that would reshape telecommunications infrastructure over the next decade, shifts that our competitors were already preparing to address while Montgomery remained focused on defending legacy markets." As our breakfast arrived, Caldwell set aside the documents and regarded me directly. "You've clearly done your homework, Ms. Montgomery. But this still doesn't explain why your father explicitly excluded you from meaningful inheritance, nor why he apparently believed your brother better suited to lead." This was the personal dimension that Walsh had instructed Reynolds to emphasize, the patriarch's judgment versus the rejected daughter's ambition. I had anticipated the question, but was determined to address it honestly rather than defensively. "My father built his understanding of business leadership in a different era," I replied. "He valued hierarchical control, positional authority, and dominating personalities. Those approaches were effective in the telecommunications industry of the 1980s and 90s. They're increasingly counterproductive in today's networked, rapidly evolving marketplace." I paused, allowing this perspective to register. My father didn't exclude me because I lacked capability. He excluded me because I represented an approach to business leadership that challenged his fundamental assumptions about how value is created and sustained. Caldwell considered this, absently stirring his coffee. "And the $1,000 bequest? That seems particularly pointed." "It was," I acknowledged. "But it reflects his personal judgment of my capabilities, not my actual track record." Northern Trust's investment committee doesn't make allocation decisions based on Richard Montgomery's personal biases. You evaluate performance metrics, strategic vision, and execution capability. This direct appeal to his professional standards struck home. Caldwell's obligation was to his investors, not to Richard Montgomery's legacy preferences. "Our position represents a significant portion of Montgomery's float," he noted. "How can you assure us that this leadership dispute won't damage enterprise value in the near term?" "By demonstrating that it's not a dispute about personalities, but about substantive strategic direction," I replied. "That's why I've scheduled a media briefing this afternoon to outline my modernization vision publicly. Complete transparency regarding the fundamental business issues at stake serves all shareholders' interests." Caldwell's eyebrows rose. "Going public is a significant escalation. Your father would never have aired internal strategic discussions in that forum. Which is precisely why Montgomery's market position has eroded while our communication remains locked in outdated patterns," I countered. "Modern investors and customers expect transparency and forward-looking vision, not carefully controlled corporate mystique." Our conversation continued through breakfast, moving from strategic positioning to specific operational initiatives. Caldwell's questions became increasingly substantive, focusing on implementation timelines and resource allocation, rather than the political dimensions Walsh had emphasized through Reynolds. As we concluded, Caldwell offered a measured assessment. "You've given me considerable material to evaluate before tomorrow's meeting, Ms. Montgomery. Whatever position Northern Trust ultimately takes, I appreciate your willingness to engage directly on the substantive issues. That's all I ask, that decisions be made on business fundamentals rather than personal history or loyalty considerations." He nodded thoughtfully. "Your grandfather would have appreciated that perspective. For all his traditional trappings, William was ruthlessly pragmatic when it came to business decisions. I smiled, recognizing the subtle shift in his framing, from comparing me unfavorably to my father to finding alignment with my grandfather's approach. It wasn't an explicit endorsement, but it suggested Caldwell was reconsidering the narrative Walsh had constructed. After parting ways with Caldwell, I returned to my apartment to prepare for the afternoon media briefing. Valerie and Bernard Whitaker were waiting, along with Patricia Martinez, Meridian's communications director who would manage the press interaction. Caldwell seemed receptive, I reported, though not fully committed. At minimum, I think we've neutralized Walsh's influence through Reynolds. That's significant progress, Whitaker observed. Northern Trust's position could be decisive tomorrow. Patricia outlined the media briefing structure, emphasizing key messages and anticipated questions. We had secured commitments from 6 influential financial journalists representing major business publications and networks. The format would be a short presentation followed by moderated Q&A, designed to demonstrate confidence and transparency, while maintaining control of the narrative. We've prepared responses to likely questions about the family dynamics, Patricia noted, but the emphasis throughout should remain on strategic vision rather than personal conflict. Agreed, I confirmed. This isn't about vindicating my position, it's about articulating the clear business case for modernization. As Patricia departed to finalize arrangements, my secure phone chimed with a message from Sophia. Norwood. Formally approved 48-hour extension of Madison exclusivity, Walsh and Michael informed. Emergency board call scheduled for 2 p.m. This was a critical development. Walsh and Michael would be scrambling to adjust their strategy now that the artificial timeline pressure had been neutralized. The emergency board call indicated they were already formulating a countermove. Michael will try to force a board vote to reject the extension, I predicted. We need to ensure the directors understand that rejecting superior financing terms without proper evaluation would constitute a breach of fiduciary duty. Whitaker nodded grimly. I'll draft a formal notice to that effect and distribute it to all board members before the call. The Blackwood letter should arrive simultaneously, further undermining their position. As Whitaker departed to prepare the notice, Valerie updated me on an unexpected development. Rachel extracted additional information from Reynolds last night. Apparently, the surveillance of your communications didn't originate with Michael or Walsh. I looked up sharply. Then who authorized it? According to what Reynolds let slip, it was initiated by your father shortly after you joined Meridian Capital. He was concerned about potential conflicts of interest with Montgomery vendors and partners. The revelation was jarring but clarifying. My father hadn't just dismissed my capabilities. He had actively monitored my professional activities, seeking evidence to confirm his biases. The surveillance wasn't a response to perceived threat, but an attempt to validate pre-existing judgment. Does this change our approach? Valerie asked. I considered the implications. No. It reinforces the fundamental issue. My father's leadership philosophy was rooted in control and distrust rather than collaboration and innovation. That's precisely the dynamic that needs to change for Montgomery. Industries to thrive going forward. The afternoon media briefing proceeded exactly as planned. From the moment I stepped to the podium in Meridian's conference center, the narrative focus shifted from familial conflict to strategic vision. I outlined the technological transformation sweeping through telecommunications infrastructure, the specific opportunities for Montgomery Industries to lead that transformation, and the detailed implementation roadmap I had developed. The journalists' questions were substantive and probing, focusing on technical feasibility, competitive positioning, and financial projections rather than the family drama Walsh had been cultivating through selective leaks. When the inevitable questions about my father's will and my brother's opposition arose, I addressed them directly but briefly before returning to the business fundamentals. The $1,000 bequest in my father's will reflected his personal assessment of my capabilities, I acknowledged. The investment position I've built in Montgomery Industries reflects my professional assessment of the company's potential. I believe shareholders and stakeholders are better served by focusing on the latter. By the briefing's conclusion, the narrative had been successfully reframed. The first headlines appearing online emphasized, Montgomery Air proposes technological revitalization and Eleanor Montgomery outlines infrastructure modernization strategy rather than familial conflict. More importantly, the substantive details of my strategic vision were now publicly available, forcing Michael and Walsh to respond on those terms rather than continuing to focus on fabricated allegations and procedural maneuvers. The transparency created accountability that would complicate their efforts to dismiss my approach without engaging with its fundamentals. As evening approached, reports from the emergency board call confirmed that our countermeasures had been effective. Michael's attempt to reject the Madison exclusivity extension had failed to secure majority support, with several directors explicitly citing the need to properly evaluate the alternative financing terms I had secured through Meridian. They've lost the timeline advantage, Whitaker reported with satisfaction. Without the artificial pressure of the Madison closing, tomorrow's shareholder meeting will focus on the actual leadership and strategic questions rather than rushing decisions to meet an arbitrary deadline. The pendulum had swung decisively in our favor. Walsh's carefully constructed strategy had been dismantled piece by piece, the fabricated Blackwood allegations neutralized by direct refutation from the firm itself. The Madison timeline pressure eliminated through Norwood's extension. The institutional investor outreach countered by direct engagement on substantive issues, and the narrative control shifted through the public articulation of my strategic vision. As I reviewed final preparations for the morning's shareholder meeting, my secure phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Curious, I answered to find Philip Norwood on the line. Ms. Montgomery, he began without preamble, I've reviewed the Meridian financing terms in detail. They're substantially superior to the Westlake package, as you indicated. I appreciate your thorough evaluation, Mr. Norwood. I've also watched your media briefing this afternoon, he continued. Your articulation of the technological transformation affecting the telecommunications infrastructure sector aligns precisely with Madison's assessment. It's why we were open to acquisition in the first place. We recognize the need for integration with a larger platform to fully capitalize on the emerging opportunities. His phrasing suggested a shift in perspective that extended beyond financing terms. What are you proposing, Mr. Norwood? A modification to our agreement structure, he replied. Madison's board is prepared to proceed with the acquisition, regardless of tomorrow's leadership outcome, provided that our technology integration follows the modernization roadmap you outlined rather than being subordinated to legacy business units, as your brother has proposed. This was an unexpected but powerful development. Norwood was effectively endorsing my strategic vision by making it a condition of the acquisition, fundamentally changing the dynamic from a question of which Montgomery would lead to which strategic approach would be implemented. That's a significant modification to the terms, I observed. It reflects our assessment of the competitive landscape, Norwood replied matter-of-factly. Your brother's approach preserves short-term revenue at the expense of long-term positioning. As Madison shareholders, we have an interest in ensuring our technology assets are deployed optimally within the combined entity. The implications were profound. By insisting on implementation of my strategic vision regardless of leadership outcome, Norwood had created a scenario where Michael would be forced to either adopt my approach or lose the Madison acquisition entirely. I believe we can accommodate that condition, I replied carefully. I'll have Whitaker draft the appropriate language for review by your legal team. After concluding the call, I shared the development with Valerie, who immediately grasped its significance. This effectively separates your strategic vision from the question of personal leadership, she observed. Even if Michael somehow maintains control tomorrow, he'll be contractually bound to implement your modernization roadmap, which fundamentally changes the nature of the shareholder decision, I agreed. It's no longer about choosing between competing visions, but about determining who is best equipped to implement the vision that's now embedded in the Madison acquisition terms. It was the final piece falling into place, the culmination of our preparation phase, and the perfect positioning for tomorrow's confrontation. Walsh and Michael had framed the conflict as loyalty to Richard's legacy versus supporting an untested outsider. Now that frame had been inverted. The choice was between embracing the future already endorsed by key stakeholders or clinging to outdated approaches that threatened the very acquisition they had championed. As I finalized my presentation, for the morning's meeting, I felt a quiet confidence that transcended the personal vindication I had initially sought. Whatever happened tomorrow, Montgomery Industries would be implementing the strategic vision I had developed, either with me leading directly or with Michael constrained by the terms Norwood had established. The $1,000 bequest that was meant to be my father's final judgment had instead become the catalyst for fundamental transformation of the company he had spent his life building. There was a certain poetic justice in that outcome, one I suspected my grandfather might have appreciated, even if my father never could. Monday morning arrived with the crystalline clarity that often accompanies pivotal moments. I dressed with deliberate care, a tailored charcoal suit that conveyed authority without ostentation, paired with my grandfather's vintage watch, a subtle connection to Montgomery heritage that wouldn't be lost on long-standing board members. Valerie met me in the lobby of my apartment building, her expression reflecting a mixture of confidence and measured caution. "The financial press is already gathering at Montgomery Tower," she reported. "Your media briefing yesterday created significant anticipation for this morning's outcome." And Walsh's response? Nothing direct, but 3 different anonymously sourced articles appeared overnight, questioning your experience and suggesting the modernization timeline is unrealistic. She handed me her tablet displaying the headlines. The talking points are consistent enough to indicate coordinated placement. A predictable countermove, I noted, scanning the articles, but notably light on substantive criticism of the strategic framework itself. "The Madison modification has them scrambling," Valerie agreed. "They're attacking your qualifications because they can't effectively challenge the strategic direction now that Norwood has endorsed it." Bernard Whitaker was waiting when we arrived at Montgomery Tower, his bow tie perfectly aligned despite the early hour. "All directors are present," he informed me as we walked toward the executive elevator. "Northern Trust, Blackstone, and Wellington. Representatives have arrived for the shareholder portion. Institutional proxy advisors from Glass Lewis and ISS are also in attendance." The presence of proxy advisory representatives was significant. They rarely attended individual company meetings unless the outcome had broader governance implications for the market. Their observations would shape recommendations to institutional investors beyond those directly involved in Montgomery. "Any sign of Walsh?" I asked. "He arrived with Michael 30 minutes ago," Whitaker confirmed. "They've been meeting privately, with Reynolds and 2 other directors before the formal session." A final attempt to consolidate support, Valerie surmised, or to adjust their strategy given the developments of the past 48 hours, I suggested. We entered the boardroom, to find it transformed from its usual configuration. The massive mahogany table had been supplemented with additional seating arranged in concentric semicircles, accommodating the expanded attendance for the special shareholder meeting. The Montgomery Industries logo dominated the wall behind the chairman's position, the stylized M that my grandfather had designed himself to represent connectivity and continuity, as he often explained. Michael was already seated at the center position, flanked by Reynolds and Walsh. His expression remained carefully neutral as I entered, though I caught the momentary tightening of his jaw. Walsh, by contrast, offered a slight nod of professional acknowledgement, one strategic operator recognizing another across the battlefield. I took my position directly opposite Michael, with Valerie and Whitaker on either side. As other attendees settled into their seats, I noted Andrew Caldwell from Northern Trust, placing his briefing materials at a center position, suggesting he intended to take an active role in the proceedings. At precisely 9 a.m., Harold Dawson called the meeting to order with a formal recitation of the agenda. This special session has been called to address questions regarding leadership direction and strategic priorities following the succession of Michael Montgomery to the CEO position upon Richard Montgomery's passing. Dawson's phrasing was deliberately neutral, avoiding explicit reference to the contest that everyone present understood was unfolding. As is customary in such sessions, we will begin with presentations from key principals before opening to shareholder questions and potential motions. Michael rose first, buttoning his suit jacket as he moved to the podium. His presentation was polished and precise, a vision of Montgomery Industries that emphasized stability, continuity, and measured evolution of existing business lines. He highlighted his lifelong immersion in company operations and deep relationships with key clients and partners. Montgomery Industries has thrived for 3 generations by building upon established strengths rather than chasing industry fads, he asserted, the subtle dig at my modernization strategy unmistakable. Our legacy business units generate the reliable cash flow that funds our future development. Disrupting that foundation to pursue speculative technological shifts would jeopardize the stable returns our shareholders have come to expect. He concluded with a direct appeal to tradition. My father entrusted me with carrying forward the Montgomery legacy because he recognized the value of consistent leadership during periods of market uncertainty. The emergency of a previously uninvolved shareholder, regardless of technical ownership percentage, should not derail the orderly transition he envisioned. The framing was skillful, positioning his leadership as the stable, responsible choice against the implied risk and disruption I represented. Had this meeting occurred 3 days earlier, before our systematic dismantling of Walsh's strategy, it might have proven persuasive to risk-averse institutional investors. As I rose to take my turn at the podium, I felt a momentary connection to countless corporate leaders who had stood at similar inflection points, where the choice between comfortable continuity and necessary transformation would determine an organization's trajectory for years or decades to come. Montgomery Industries was founded on a simple but powerful insight, I began, deliberately echoing my grandfather's words from the company's original prospectus. That communications infrastructure must evolve ahead of consumer demand, not in response to it. I activated the presentation display, showing a historical timeline of Montgomery's major strategic pivots alongside industry inflection points. William Montgomery made the decisive shift from copper to fiber optics years before market demand materialized, positioning the company to lead rather than follow the subsequent transformation. That forward-looking approach established Montgomery as an industry leader. The next slide compared R&D investment and new technology adoption rates across 3 generations of Montgomery leadership. Under my grandfather, Montgomery consistently led the industry in embracing emerging technologies. Under my father, that innovation advantage gradually eroded as focus shifted to optimizing existing business lines rather than positioning for future transitions. I paused, allowing the data to register before continuing. The telecommunications infrastructure sector stands at another inflection point today, one that requires the same forward-looking investment approach that built Montgomery's initial success. Over the next 15 minutes, I outlined the comprehensive modernization strategy I had developed, emphasizing 3 key technological transformations that would reshape the industry landscape over the next decade. The presentation was meticulously detailed, supported by market data, competitive analysis, and financial projections that demonstrated how initial investment would translate to sustainable growth. This isn't about choosing between stability and innovation, I emphasized, directly addressing Michael's framing. It's about recognizing that in rapidly evolving markets, innovation is the only sustainable source of stability. Our legacy business units aren't threatened by this modernization strategy, They're enhanced and extended by it. I concluded by addressing the leadership question directly. The choice before shareholders today isn't between competing personalities or family factions. It's between competing visions for Montgomery's future, one that preserves the status quo until market shifts force reactive adaptation, and one that positions the company to lead those shifts proactively, as my grandfather did when he built the foundation of our success. As I returned to my seat, I noted Walsh leaning toward Michael, whispering something that caused my brother's expression to darken momentarily. The interaction suggested they had anticipated a different approach, perhaps a more personal appeal, or direct criticism of Michael's leadership, rather than the substantive strategic comparison I had presented. Harold Dawson moved the meeting into the Q&A phase, where institutional representatives and board members could address questions to either Michael or me. Andrew Caldwell from Northern Trust was the first to rise. "Ms. Montgomery," he began, "your modernization timeline proposes significant capital reallocation from established business units to emerging technology development. How do you reconcile that approach with maintaining the dividend stability that many institutional investors rely upon?" The question went directly to the most legitimate concern regarding my strategy: the potential near-term impact on shareholder returns during the investment phase. Michael leaned forward slightly, clearly anticipating that this vulnerability would undermine my position with income-focused institutional investors. The modernization strategy includes a comprehensive capital allocation framework specifically designed to maintain dividend stability, I replied, advancing to a detailed financial slide I had prepared for precisely this objection. The investment funding comes primarily from three sources that don't impact current dividend capacity: operational efficiencies in legacy systems, strategic partnerships that share development costs, and the optimized financing structure for acquisitions like Madison Technologies. I highlighted the specific projections. Under this model, dividend capacity remains stable for the first 3 years while investment accelerates, then increases by approximately 12% annually as the new business lines mature. This approach protects current income requirements while building substantial growth capacity. Caldwell nodded with evident approval before addressing his next question to Michael. "Mr. Montgomery, given that Madison Technologies has now explicitly conditioned their acquisition agreement on implementing the modernization roadmap Ms. Montgomery has outlined, how would your leadership approach differ in executing that strategy?" The question was masterfully constructed to highlight the fundamental contradiction in Michael's position following Norwood's modification to the Madison terms. He needed to either acknowledge he would implement my strategic vision despite his criticisms, or suggest he would somehow circumvent contractual obligations to maintain his preferred approach. Michael's response was notably less fluid than his prepared remarks had been. The Madison integration would proceed according to the agreed terms, while we evaluate the broader modernization timeline to ensure it aligns with our established business priorities and risk parameters. And if that evaluation suggests modifications to the approach that conflict with the Madison Agreement conditions, Caldwell pressed, we would negotiate appropriate adjustments with Madison leadership based on operational realities as they emerge, Michael replied, his discomfort with the questioning evident in his stiffening posture. The evasive answer prompted a follow-up from Margaret Chen of Blackstone. "To clarify, Mr. Montgomery, your position is that the contractual commitments regarding Madison's technology integration would be subject to renegotiation after the acquisition closes?" Walsh whispered urgently to Michael, clearly attempting to guide his response to this increasingly problematic line of questioning. But the damage was done. Michael's answer had revealed a fundamental unwillingness to fully commit to the modernization strategy despite its incorporation into binding acquisition terms. "Our commitment is to successful integration that serves Montgomery shareholders' long-term interests," Michael stated, the corporate platitude falling flat in the context of specific contractual questions. Chen turned her attention to me. "Ms. Montgomery, The Madison Agreement modification incorporates your strategic vision regardless of leadership outcome. If shareholders were to maintain the current leadership structure, how would you utilize your board position to ensure adherence to the agreed modernization approach? The question presented a perfect opportunity to demonstrate collaborative intent rather than personal ambition. I would establish clear implementation milestones and accountability metrics through the Strategic Planning Committee, working constructively with management to ensure successful execution while respecting established leadership roles. My answer struck the necessary balance, asserting appropriate oversight without threatening destabilizing conflict if the leadership vote didn't go my way. The contrast with Michael's defensive evasion was striking and deliberate. As the questioning continued, a clear pattern emerged. The institutional representatives and independent directors focused increasingly on substantive implementation questions related to the modernization strategy rather than challenging its fundamental direction. The underlying assumption had shifted. The modernization approach was now treated as the agreed path forward, with the remaining question being who would lead its implementation most effectively. Walsh recognized this shift before Michael did. I observed him passing a handwritten note to my brother, who read it with a slight frown before nodding almost imperceptibly. The dynamic between them had subtly changed. Walsh was no longer guiding a predetermined strategy, but attempting to mitigate damage as the carefully constructed narrative collapsed. After nearly an hour of substantive questioning, Harold Dawson called for final statements before proceeding to potential motions and votes. Michael rose first, his approach noticeably adjusted from his opening presentation. Having heard the comprehensive discussion of strategic directions, I acknowledge the compelling aspects of the modernization framework my sister has developed, he began. The partial concession clearly painful, but strategically necessary. As your CEO, I am prepared to incorporate these elements into our forward planning, while ensuring they complement rather than disrupt our established business strengths. The pivot was Walsh's influence, recognizing that complete opposition to the modernization strategy had become untenable, and attempting to position Michael as capable of implementing it with appropriate balance. It was a skilled adjustment to changing circumstances, but it came too late to be fully credible after his earlier resistance. When my turn came, I focused on unity rather than division. Montgomery Industries faces transformative opportunities that will require the contributions of everyone in this room. The leadership question before us isn't about individual control, but about establishing the optimal framework for navigating complex technological and market transitions. I deliberately avoided framing the choice as a binary competition between Michael and me. Whatever structure shareholders determine will best serve the company's future, my commitment is to ensuring Montgomery Industries reclaims its position as an industry leader in anticipating and shaping technological evolution rather than merely responding to it. As I concluded, I noted Andrew Caldwell conferring briefly with representatives from Wellington and several other institutional investors. The pattern of communication suggested coordination emerging among the key shareholders who would determine the outcome of any vote. Harold Dawson moved to the formal motion phase. The floor is now open for shareholder motions regarding leadership structure and strategic direction. Andrew Caldwell rose immediately. Northern Trust moves to establish a dual leadership structure with Michael Montgomery continuing as Chief Executive Officer and Eleanor Montgomery appointed as Executive Chair with specific oversight of strategic, planning, and technology development. The proposed compromise caught both Michael and me by surprise. Rather than forcing a binary choice between competing leadership claims, Caldwell had constructed a power-sharing arrangement that acknowledged both our positions while creating a structured framework for the modernization strategy's implementation. Thomas Reynolds, clearly alarmed by this unexpected development, attempted to counter. This motion constitutes a significant governance change that requires more thorough evaluation than today's session permits. On the contrary, Margaret Chen interjected, dual leadership structures are well established in multiple industries, particularly during periods of strategic transformation. Blackstone seconds the Northern Trust motion and recommends immediate consideration. Watching Walsh's expression, I could see him rapidly calculating implications and adjusting his advice to Michael accordingly. The proposed structure would preserve Michael's operational authority while giving me explicit mandate for the strategic transformation, a compromise that addressed the core issues while allowing both sides to claim partial victory. After consulting with Walsh, Michael addressed the room. While this proposal was unexpected, I am willing to consider a collaborative leadership approach that maintains operational stability while incorporating forward-looking strategic elements. The qualified acceptance was as close to agreement as Michael could manage without appearing to completely surrender his position. It was enough to move the process forward to formal consideration. Harold Dawson called for discussion of the motion, but the institutional representatives had clearly coordinated their position in advance. After minimal procedural clarification, the measure was brought to a vote. The outcome wasn't unanimous, but was decisive. 76% in favor of the dual leadership structure, with Reynolds and his aligned directors comprising most of the opposition. The Montgomery family civil war had concluded not with the complete victory of either faction, but with a structured settlement that institutionalized the modernization strategy while preserving elements of continuity. As the meeting transitioned to implementation details, I caught Walsh observing me with professional appreciation. He offered a slight nod, acknowledgement from one strategic operator to another that the battlefield had produced an unexpected but stable resolution. Michael's reaction was more complex, a mixture of relief that he had maintained a leadership role and lingering resentment at the constraints now formalized in the governance structure. When our eyes met across the boardroom, I saw resignation rather than reconciliation. This wasn't the end of our philosophical conflict, merely its transformation into a more structured form. By early afternoon, the formal documentation of the new leadership structure was complete. Press releases were drafted, regulatory filings prepared, and transition teams established. The mechanics of corporate governance proceeded with practiced efficiency, transforming the morning's contested terrain into formalized organizational charts and responsibility matrices. As the boardroom gradually emptied, Michael finally approached me directly, Walsh conspicuously absent from his side for the first time since the conflict began. "This isn't what Father would have wanted," he said quietly, the first personal comment he had directed to me since the shareholder meeting began. "No," I agreed. "But it's what the company needs." A flicker of understanding passed between us. Not agreement, certainly not warmth, but perhaps the first acknowledgement that our conflict transcended personal grievances to reflect genuinely different visions of leadership and organizational purpose. "Walsh will be departing now that the immediate situation is resolved," Michael informed me. "His specialty is crisis management, not ongoing governance." The statement was partly informational, partly a subtle peace offering, removing the most aggressive element of his opposition strategy now that a settlement had been reached. "A wise decision," I replied. "The dual leadership structure will function more effectively without external strategists influencing either side." Michael nodded stiffly before adding, "The Madison integration timeline will require immediate attention. Norwood expects a joint call this afternoon to confirm our commitment to the modified terms. I'll have my team coordinate with yours." "To prepare," I responded, accepting the implicit acknowledgement that collaborative work would begin immediately despite our personal reservations. As Michael departed, Bernard Whitaker approached with uncharacteristic informality. "Your grandfather would have appreciated the elegance of this resolution," he observed. "William always believed in structural solutions to leadership challenges." "The $1,000 bequest created one outcome," I noted. "This morning created another entirely." Whitaker smiled slightly. Richard's final judgment proved less definitive than he anticipated. As the corporate machinery accelerated around, press statements being finalized, organizational charts redrawn, transition teams assembled, I found myself reflecting on the journey from that first devastating moment at the will reading to this unexpectedly balanced resolution. The dual leadership structure wasn't the complete vindication I had initially sought when building my ownership position in Montgomery Industries. It was something more complex and potentially more valuable, a framework that institutionalized the modernization vision while creating accountability mechanisms that would transcend any individual's authority. My father's $1,000 bequest had been intended as his final judgment of my capabilities and worth. Instead, it had become the catalyst for fundamental transformation of the company he had spent his life building. There was profound irony in that outcome. His attempt to exclude me had created the very conditions that forced the organization to confront its strategic limitations and embrace a new direction. As executive chair with explicit authority over strategic planning and technology development, I now had formal mandate to implement the modernization roadmap that had been incorporated into the Madison acquisition terms. Michael would retain operational control of existing business units, creating necessary continuity while the transformation proceeded. It wasn't the clear victory that either of us had sought, but it was perhaps the outcome that best served Montgomery Industries itself, blending innovation with stability, transformation with continuity, in a structured framework that forced productive tension rather than destructive conflict. As I gathered my materials to depart for the scheduled call with Philip Norwood, Valerie offered a simple observation that captured the essence of the morning's resolution. You came to prove your father wrong. You ended up proving your grandfather right. The distinction was profound. William Montgomery had built the company on the principle that communications infrastructure must evolve ahead of consumer demand, not in response to it. That forward-looking approach had been gradually subordinated to my father's preference for optimizing established business lines rather than investing in emerging technologies. The dual leadership structure now formalized at Montgomery Industries didn't just resolve a family succession dispute. It institutionalized a return to the foundational philosophy that had built the company's initial success, updated for contemporary technological realities. My father's dismissive bequest had reflected his personal judgment, rooted in outdated assumptions about leadership and business strategy. The shareholders' verdict reflected market realities and forward-looking assessment of the company's needs. As I prepared to begin the actual work of transformation, starting with the Madison integration that would serve as proof of concept for the broader modernization strategy, I felt a sense of purpose that transcended personal vindication. The $1,000 check that had symbolized my father's final judgment would remain uncashed, preserved as a reminder that the most profound legacy isn't financial inheritance, but the opportunity to build something that outlasts individual limitations. Montgomery Industries was embarking on its next chapter, not as the continuation of Richard Montgomery's vision, nor as the fulfillment of my personal ambition, but as an enterprise adapting to evolving market realities, with a governance structure designed to balance innovation and stability. The decisive action hadn't been a single triumphant moment, but a series of strategic moves that collectively transformed conflict into structured collaboration. In that transformation lay the true victory, not over my father's memory or my brother's authority, but over the organizational inertia that had gradually compromised Montgomery's market position. The work of actual transformation still lay ahead. Implementing the modernization roadmap would require navigating countless operational challenges and organizational resistance. But the governance framework established today created the conditions for that work to proceed with appropriate authority and accountability. As I departed Montgomery Tower for the first official meeting under the new leadership structure, I glanced back at the portraits of Montgomery patriarchs that lined the executive corridor. To their stern, judgmental gazes, I offered neither defiance nor submission, but the simple acknowledgement that their enterprise would continue evolving beyond any individual's vision or control. That evolution, not personal vindication or familial triumph, was the true measure of success. The $1,000 bequest that was meant to be my father's final judgment had instead become the first investment in Montgomery Industries' future. The weeks following the shareholder meeting brought a whirlwind of activity as Montgomery Industries adjusted to its new leadership structure. The dual executive arrangement, Michael as CEO and myself as executive chair, created ripple effects throughout the organization, challenging deeply entrenched norms and operational assumptions. Our first joint executive meeting revealed the magnitude of the cultural transformation ahead. Michael had assembled his leadership team in the main conference room, with department heads arranged in their traditional hierarchy around the table. When I arrived, there was a momentary confusion about seating arrangements. The head position at the table had always belonged to the CEO, but the new governance structure complicated this symbolic allocation of authority. Michael hesitated briefly before gesturing to a position adjacent to his traditional seat. "We should probably establish a consistent protocol for these sessions," he noted, the professional courtesy masking lingering discomfort with the shared leadership model. "Perhaps a round-table format would better reflect the collaborative approach we're establishing," I suggested, conscious that even furniture arrangements carried significant cultural messages in an organization as tradition-bound as Montgomery Industries. The discussion that followed illustrated the fundamental differences in our leadership philosophies. Michael's approach centered on hierarchical information flow and decision-making, with department heads reporting upward through established channels. My questions about cross-functional collaboration and distributed problem-solving created visible discomfort among executives accustomed to staying within their siloed domains. "We need to establish clear accountability structures for the Madison integration," Michael emphasized, displaying a project management chart with neatly delineated responsibilities. "Each function needs defined deliverables and timelines." "Agreed," I responded, "but technological integration requires fluid boundaries between traditional departments." The modernization framework depends on cross-functional teams, with authority to make real-time decisions as implementation challenges emerge. The tension wasn't overtly adversarial, but reflected fundamentally different mental models of organizational effectiveness. Michael viewed structure and hierarchy as sources of clarity and accountability. I saw them as potential barriers to the innovation and adaptation needed for successful modernization. Philip Norwood's insights during our first integration planning session captured this distinction succinctly. "Montgomery operates like a traditional command and control hierarchy," he observed after a particularly circular discussion about reporting structures. "Madison functions more like a network organization, with authority distributed based on expertise rather than position." "Different industries evolve different cultures," Michael replied defensively. "True," Norwood acknowledged. "But successful integration will require both organizations to adopt hybrid approaches. The contractual commitments regarding Madison's technology positioning can't be fulfilled through traditional hierarchical management alone." This reality became increasingly apparent as implementation planning progressed. The modernization roadmap required collaborative approaches that challenged Montgomery's established culture. Technical teams needed authority to make decisions that traditionally would have required multiple layers of approval. Information needed to flow horizontally across departments rather than vertically through management chains. 2 weeks into the integration process, Gregory Vance requested a private meeting to discuss emerging financial implications. "The dual leadership structure is creating some unforeseen complications," he began cautiously. "Operational departments are receiving seemingly contradictory guidance about investment priorities." "Can you provide specifics?" I asked. "The Network Infrastructure Division received your strategic directive about accelerating the regional platform upgrades," Vance explained. Simultaneously, they received Michael's quarterly budget guidance emphasizing cost control and deferral of capital-intensive projects. They're understandably confused about which directive takes precedence. The situation highlighted the need for more explicit coordination mechanisms between Michael's operational authority and my strategic oversight. That evening, I drafted a governance protocol that delineated decision rights across different categories of initiatives, with clear parameters for joint approval requirements versus delegated authority. When I presented it to Michael the next morning, his response was measured but skeptical. This adds procedural complexity to decisions that used to be straightforward. The straightforward approach wasn't serving us well, I countered. Our market position has been eroding precisely because strategic initiatives were consistently subordinated to short-term operational priorities. Michael studied the proposal, his expression revealing the internal calculation of implications for his authority. The board approved a dual leadership structure, not a transfer of CEO decision rights. This isn't about diminishing CEO authority, I clarified. It's about establishing clear protocols for areas where our responsibilities intersect. The confusion Vance identified affects implementation velocity for initiatives that shareholders have explicitly endorsed. After lengthy negotiation, we established a working framework that preserved Michael's operational authority while creating protected pathways for strategic initiatives identified in the modernization roadmap. The Madison integration would serve as a test case for these new governance mechanisms. Beyond the executive suite, the consequences of our leadership transition manifested in unexpected ways throughout the organization. Middle managers who had built careers navigating Richard Montgomery's hierarchical structure found themselves struggling to interpret the new power dynamics. Some attempted to curry favor with both leadership centers, delivering different messages depending on the audience. Others chose clear alignment with either Michael's operational focus or my strategic initiatives. Harold Dawson observed this phenomenon during a board update 3 weeks after the shareholder meeting. The organization is developing interesting factional behaviors, he noted. Not openly adversarial, but definitely oriented around different priorities and approaches. That's not necessarily unhealthy, I responded. The modernization strategy requires champions throughout the organization who are committed to transformation rather than preservation of the status quo. Perhaps, Dawson acknowledged, but it requires careful management to prevent counterproductive competition for resources and attention. He was right. The dual leadership structure created conditions for productive tension, but that tension needed appropriate channels and boundaries to avoid devolving into organizational paralysis or open conflict. The Madison acquisition formally closed 30 days after the shareholder meeting, with the modified terms intact despite Michael's initial reservations. The integration process accelerated, with joint teams establishing ambitious timelines for technology deployment and market expansion. External consequences of our leadership transition emerged as customers, partners, and competitors adjusted to Montgomery Industries' new direction. The first major industry conference following our governance changes brought this into sharp relief. Traditionally, Richard had represented Montgomery at the annual Telecommunications Infrastructure Leadership Summit, with Michael accompanying him in recent years as the designated successor. This year, our dual leadership structure raised protocol questions about who would deliver the keynote address that Montgomery had traditionally sponsored. We should maintain continuity, Michael insisted during our planning discussion. The CEO role has always represented Montgomery at these industry functions. The content focus this year is technological transformation and infrastructure evolution, I pointed out. Those areas align directly with my executive chair responsibilities. The compromise we reached, a joint presentation highlighting Montgomery's new strategic direction, became unexpectedly significant in reshaping industry perceptions of our company. Michael opened with a reassuring overview of operational continuity, emphasizing Montgomery's established market presence and customer relationships. I followed with a detailed vision of infrastructure modernization, highlighting specific technologies and integration pathways that would position Montgomery at the forefront of emerging industry trends. The contrast in our approaches was stark but complementary. Michael spoke the language of stability and reliability that resonated with traditional telecommunications executives. My portion addressed the technological disruption that younger, industry leaders recognized as both threat and opportunity. The response exceeded our expectations. Trade publications highlighted Montgomery's Renaissance strategy that blended established infrastructure expertise with forward-looking technology integration. Several major customers reached out following the conference to discuss accelerated deployment of solutions outlined in my presentation. Competitors who had been gradually encroaching on Montgomery's market share suddenly faced questions from their own investors about strategic positioning relative to our modernization initiatives. You've fundamentally changed market perceptions of Montgomery in a single presentation, Philip Norwood observed at our next integration meeting. The industry has been viewing the company as a stable legacy player, gradually yielding position to more innovative competitors. Now you're being discussed as a potential disruptor leveraging established scale for accelerated transformation. This external validation strengthened my position internally, creating momentum for implementation of key modernization initiatives. Michael, recognizing the positive market response, became incrementally more supportive of accelerated timelines for strategic projects, though his instinct for caution and risk management remained evident in every planning discussion. The most profound consequences emerged in our financial performance indicators. The first quarterly results following our leadership transition showed modest but significant shifts in key metrics. Revenue from legacy services continued its gradual decline, but new service offerings developed through the Madison integration showed promising early adoption rates. The stock price, which had stagnated for nearly 3 years, began a steady upward trajectory as analysts incorporated our modernization strategy into their valuation models. Andrew Caldwell called personally after reviewing the quarterly performance. Northern Trust is pleased with the initial indicators, he noted. The dual leadership structure appears to be delivering the balanced approach we anticipated. The real test will come when implementation challenges require difficult trade-offs between short-term performance and strategic positioning, I replied. Indeed, he agreed. But the governance framework you've established creates appropriate mechanisms for those decisions. The board's strategic planning committee provides necessary oversight without impeding operational execution. The personal consequences of our leadership transition were perhaps the most complex to navigate. My relationship with Michael remained professionally functional, but emotionally distant. Our weekly coordination meetings maintained formal courtesy that never evolved toward genuine collegiality. We had established effective working protocols, but not mutual trust or shared vision. This dynamic was tested when our mother, Caroline, hosted her first family dinner since our father's passing. The evening began with stilted conversation, carefully avoiding any mention of Montgomery Industries or the leadership transition that had so fundamentally altered our family dynamics. The foundation gala preparation is consuming all my attention, Caroline remarked, desperately maintaining neutral topics through the first course. The committee has entirely reimagined the donor recognition approach this year. The artifice collapsed when Michael's wife, Julia, innocently inquired about recent media coverage. The Business Journal profile was quite flattering, Eleanor. They seem very impressed with your modernization strategy. An uncomfortable silence descended over the dining room. Caroline looked stricken, Michael tensed visibly, and Julia realized too late the boundary she had inadvertently crossed. The article exaggerated my individual role, I offered, attempting to diffuse the tension. The strategy reflects input from throughout the organization, including contributions from leadership that actually built operational understanding from the ground up, Michael added pointedly, rather than theoretical perspectives developed at a distance. The comment revealed the persistent wound to his pride, the implication that my strategic vision had gained recognition that overshadowed his lifetime of dedicated service to the company. Different perspectives have different value, I replied. Carefully. The shareholders clearly believed both approaches were necessary for Montgomery's future success. Caroline interrupted with transparent desperation. The gardener has done wonderful work with the East Terrace renovation. Perhaps we could view it before dessert? The moment passed, but it illustrated the personal consequences that would likely never fully heal. Michael experienced the leadership transition as partial disinheritance, a qualification of the absolute authority he had been groomed to expect. I had achieved organizational influence, but at the cost of any hope for genuine family reconciliation. The most unexpected personal consequence emerged during a conversation with Bernard Whitaker, 6 weeks after the shareholder meeting. He had requested a private lunch, arriving with an unmarked folder that he placed carefully on the table after preliminaries. "I've been organizing your father's personal papers," he began. His will specified that certain documents should remain private until after the estate settlement was completed. "I assume anything important related to Montgomery Industries has already been addressed through corporate channels," I noted. "This isn't exactly corporate," Whitaker replied, opening the folder to reveal a handwritten letter on Richard Montgomery's personal stationery. This was drafted approximately 3 months before his death, with instructions that it be delivered to you after the leadership transition was finalized. I stared at the letter. My father's distinctive handwriting immediately recognizable, despite increasing shakiness that betrayed his declining health. "Did you read it?" "No," Whitaker assured me. "I was merely instructed to deliver it at the appropriate time. I considered declining to read it at all. What could Richard possibly say posthumously that would mitigate the $1,000 bequest and its clear message?" But curiosity prevailed over caution. The letter was brief and direct, characteristic of Richard's communication style. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, events have unfolded differently than I anticipated. While I designated Michael as my singular successor, your actions have evidently created an alternate path. You have always challenged my understanding of business leadership, questioning hierarchies I consider essential, proposing collaborative approaches I find inefficient, advocating perspectives I consider untested against market realities. I do not expect the $1,000 bequest to deter you if you've truly developed the strategic conviction you've claimed. A Montgomery who believes in their vision doesn't yield to symbolic gestures, regardless of how pointed. If you've secured a position of influence within the company despite my arrangements, you will have demonstrated a determination I grudgingly respect, if not an approach I endorse. Montgomery Industries has survived for 3 generations by adapting to market evolutions while maintaining core principles. Whether your approach represents necessary adaptation or misguided disruption will be determined by results, not intentions. I have instructed Bernard to deliver this letter only after leadership. Questions are formally resolved. Whatever structure has emerged, remember that legacy is measured in decades, not quarters. The Montgomery name carries obligations beyond personal ambition or vindication. Richard Montgomery. I read the letter twice, absorbing its implications. It wasn't an apology or reconciliation, nor was it further condemnation. It was something more complex, a contingency message predicated on my having found a way to overcome his explicit exclusion. The most revealing element was the admission that he had considered this outcome sufficiently possible to prepare for it. Despite his dismissal of my capabilities, some part of him had recognized the determination and strategic thinking that might enable me to secure influence despite his deliberate barriers. Did my father leave similar letters for Michael or anyone else? I asked Whitaker. Several, he confirmed. Different messages to be delivered under different outcome scenarios. Richard had hedged his posthumous messaging just as he had hedged critical business decisions, creating contingencies for multiple potential outcomes while presenting absolute certainty to those around him. It was a revealing insight into his leadership psychology. I returned the letter to its folder, processing its significance. Thank you for delivering this as instructed, Bernard. Your father was a complex man, Whitaker observed carefully. His explicit decisions didn't always reflect his complete assessment of situations. Or perhaps they reflected one assessment while he prepared for others he considered less likely but still possible, I suggested. The letter confirmed what the past weeks had increasingly revealed. The consequences of our leadership transition extended far beyond governance structures or strategic initiatives. They reached into the very narrative of Montgomery Industries, challenging not just my father's specific judgments, but his entire conception of how business leadership functioned in the modern environment. The dual leadership structure wasn't merely a compromise to resolve a succession dispute. It was a fundamental reimagining of how authority, expertise, and strategic vision should interact in a rapidly evolving industry. The $1,000 bequest that had seemed so final, a judgment had instead initiated a sequence of events that transformed the company in ways Richard Montgomery had considered possible, but not preferable. As I departed my lunch with Whitaker, a notification appeared on my phone. The Madison integration team had successfully completed the first major technology deployment ahead of schedule, with 3 key customers already reporting performance improvements that exceeded projections. The timing seemed fitting, tangible results emerging just as I processed my father's posthumous acknowledgement that outcomes, not intentions, would ultimately determine whether my approach represented progress or disruption. The consequences of our leadership transition were still unfolding, reshaping Montgomery Industries from within while repositioning it externally. The personal reconciliation I might once have hoped for with my father was impossible. But his letter offered something different: recognition, if not endorsement, of the determination that had led me to challenge his judgment and create an alternate path forward. In that recognition lay a different kind of consequence: the acknowledgement that even Richard Montgomery, with all his certainty and authority, had understood on some level that leadership transitions rarely follow the precise paths their predecessors envision. The true test of a business legacy isn't adherence to the founder's specific methods, but the capacity to evolve those methods to meet changing realities while preserving core principles. As executive chair leading Montgomery Industries' strategic transformation, I wasn't fulfilling my father's vision. I was challenging it, extending it, and in some ways transcending it. The $1,000 bequest remained uncashed in my desk drawer, a reminder that consequences often emerge from intentions in ways their originators never fully anticipate. 3 months after the shareholder meeting that established our dual leadership structure, Montgomery Industries entered a phase of systematic transformation that extended far beyond leadership titles or organizational charts. The initial adjustment period had given way to substantive rebuilding of everything from technological infrastructure to corporate culture. The Madison integration provided both catalyst and template for broader organizational changes. What began as a strategic acquisition evolved into a comprehensive fusion of capabilities that influenced every aspect of Montgomery's operations. Philip Norwood had transitioned from acquisition target CEO to valued change agent, helping bridge the cultural gaps between Madison's innovation-focused approach and Montgomery's established operational disciplines. The integration creates a natural laboratory for testing new operational models, Norwood observed during a strategic planning session. We can prototype cross-functional approaches within the Madison business units before scaling them across the broader organization. This incremental approach mitigated resistance that might have emerged from more abrupt transformation attempts. By demonstrating success within a contained environment, we created evidence-based momentum for extending similar approaches to traditional Montgomery divisions. The most visible manifestation of this rebuilding process was the creation of the Advanced Infrastructure Solutions Group, a hybrid team combining Madison's technological expertise with Montgomery's implementation capabilities and customer relationships. The unit operated with considerable autonomy, liberated from traditional hierarchical constraints while maintaining clear accountability for measurable outcomes. Within 6 months, AIS had developed and deployed next-generation network management systems for 3 major clients, generating both immediate revenue and valuable implementation data that informed our broader modernization roadmap. The group's success became an internal case study demonstrating how structural innovation could deliver concrete business results. Michael initially viewed AIS with skepticism, concerned about its exceptional status within the organizational hierarchy. Creating privileged enclaves undermines consistent operational discipline, he argued during an executive committee meeting. It's not about privilege, but about appropriate structure for specific functions, I countered. Technology innovation requires different collaboration patterns than established service delivery. The performance data gradually shifted Michael's perspective. When AIS secured a contract with Western Regional Utilities, a long-standing Montgomery client that competitors had been steadily eroding, even he acknowledged the value of the experimental structure. They're delivering impressive results, he conceded during our quarterly planning review. Though I still have concerns about scaling this approach too rapidly across established business units. This tension between innovation and stability, transformation and continuity, defined our rebuilding phase. Rather than seeking to eliminate the tension, we increasingly recognized its generative potential when properly channeled. The dual leadership structure provided natural balancing mechanisms that prevented either radical disruption or stubborn stagnation from dominating our approach. Bernard Whitaker captured this dynamic during a board update. Montgomery Industries is achieving something quite rare: evolutionary transformation rather than revolutionary upheaval. The modernization proceeds at a pace that allows operational continuity while still creating meaningful market differentiation. The rebuilding extended beyond organizational structures to our technological foundation. The systematic upgrading of core infrastructure systems proceeded according to the roadmap I had developed, with modifications based on implementation learning and evolving market conditions. What might have been theoretical planning exercises became practical deployment challenges requiring continuous adaptation. Gregory Vance emerged as an unexpected champion of this technological rebuilding, despite his traditional finance orientation. The investment thesis is proving more compelling than I initially assessed, he acknowledged 6 months into implementation. The efficiency gains from modernized infrastructure are materializing faster than projected, creating additional reinvestment capacity. This virtuous cycle, where early modernization investments generated returns that funded subsequent initiatives, accelerated our timeline without requiring the external capital that might have compromised near-term financial metrics. Michael's focus on operational discipline complemented my strategic direction, creating a balanced approach that satisfied both progressive and conservative stakeholders. The industry took notice. Trade publications that had long categorized Montgomery Industries as a legacy provider with stable but unexciting prospects began describing us as a traditional infrastructure leader executing an impressive technological pivot. Competitors who had been gradually encroaching on our market position suddenly found themselves responding to innovations rather than driving them. This external validation reinforced internal momentum, creating a rebuilding narrative that employees throughout the organization could embrace. The Montgomery Renaissance, as one industry analyst dubbed it, became a source of collective pride that transcended legacy organizational boundaries. Perhaps the most fundamental rebuilding occurred in our approach to talent development and deployment. Richard Montgomery had built his leadership model on rigidly defined career paths and specialized functional expertise. The modernization strategy required more fluid skill development and cross-disciplinary collaboration. We need to reimagine talent mobility, I emphasized during a leadership development session. Technical specialists need business context. Business leaders need technological fluency. Neither can operate effectively in isolated domains. This philosophy manifested in the Montgomery Innovation Fellowship Program, a rotational development approach that identified high-potential talent throughout the organization and immersed them in cross-functional projects outside their traditional expertise areas. The program created a cadre of leaders who understood both established operations and emerging capabilities, bridging divides that had historically limited Montgomery's adaptability. Michael initially questioned the resource allocation required for such developmental initiatives. "We're diverting productive capacity from core operations for theoretical long-term benefits," he noted during a budget review. "It's not theoretical," I responded. "The Madison integration demonstrated precisely how much productivity we lose to functional silos and communication barriers. The fellowship program addresses root causes rather than symptoms." The first cohort of Innovation Fellows provided compelling evidence supporting this investment. Their cross-functional projects generated immediate operational improvements while building leadership capabilities that would serve the organization for years to come. The program expanded with Michael's full support after demonstration projects, delivered measurable returns within the first year. Our rebuilding extended to external partnerships and ecosystem relationships as well. The traditional Montgomery approach had emphasized self-sufficiency and proprietary development, an industrial-era model increasingly ill-suited to the networked technology landscape. Our modernization strategy incorporated strategic alliances with specialized technology providers, research institutions, and even select competitors where collaboration could accelerate capability development. "The boundaries between organizations are becoming more permeable," I explained during an industry forum where Montgomery announced a partnership with a former competitor on next-generation security protocols. "Technological evolution happens too rapidly for any single organization to maintain leadership across all domains independently." This philosophical shift represented perhaps the most profound departure from Richard Montgomery's approach to business leadership. He had built the company on principles of vertical integration and controlled information flow, maintaining comprehensive ownership of all critical technologies and processes. Our rebuilding phase embraced selective integration within broader innovation ecosystems, recognizing that strategic openness often accelerated progress more effectively than protective isolation. Throughout this transformation, the dual leadership structure provided essential balance. Michael's operational focus ensured that innovation initiatives maintained connection to practical implementation constraints. My strategic direction prevented short-term considerations from dictating decisions with long-term implications. The creative tension between our approaches generated more robust solutions than either perspective might have produced independently. This balanced rebuilding produced tangible results. Our first full-year financial results under the dual leadership structure exceeded market expectations across key metrics. Revenue growth accelerated to 7.2% compared to the previous 3-year average of 2.1%. Operating margins expanded despite increased R&D investment, and the stock price appreciated 31% as investors recognized the successful combination of stability and innovation. Andrew Caldwell's assessment during Northern Trust's annual portfolio review captured the external perspective on our rebuilding phase. Montgomery Industries has executed a textbook example of strategic renewal without destructive disruption. The dual leadership model delivers complementary strengths while moderating the risks associated with either pure maintenance or radical overhaul approaches. The personal dimension of rebuilding proved more challenging than the organizational transformation. My relationship with Michael remained functional but distant, characterized by professional respect rather than personal reconciliation. Our weekly coordination meetings operated with efficient courtesy, but never evolved toward genuine warmth or shared perspective. This dynamic was particularly evident during the first annual leadership conference following our governance transition. Traditionally a celebration of Montgomery's accomplishments and culture, the event required careful navigation of the dual leadership structure. Previous conferences featured Father's comprehensive address as the centerpiece, Michael noted. During planning discussions, We need to determine how our respective roles will be represented. The solution, a joint keynote session where we each presented complementary aspects of Montgomery's direction, worked effectively as professional communication, but highlighted our contrasting styles and priorities. Michael emphasized operational excellence and customer relationships. I focused on technological transformation and market repositioning. The presentations were coherent but distinct, much like our leadership approaches. Our mother Caroline observed this dynamic with resigned acceptance during the conference dinner. "You've both found a way to honor different aspects of the Montgomery legacy," she remarked carefully. "Your father would be—" She paused, reconsidering. "He would be impressed with the results, even if the method isn't what he envisioned." The comment reflected growing recognition throughout our extended family and social circles that Montgomery Industries, under dual leadership, was achieving outcomes that Richard's singular approach might not have produced. This didn't heal the personal wounds inflicted during our leadership conflict, but it provided context that made continued collaboration sustainable, despite persistent emotional distance. My own rebuilding extended beyond professional responsibilities to include personal reflection on motivations and purposes. The journey from outraged daughter seeking vindication to executive chair guiding strategic transformation had fundamentally altered my relationship with the Montgomery legacy. This evolution became clear during a conversation with Valerie following our first board strategy retreat under the dual leadership structure. "When you began building your position in Montgomery Industries, what was the primary objective?" she asked as we reviewed the successful session outcomes. I considered the question carefully. Initially, it was about proving my father wrong, demonstrating that his judgment of my capabilities was fundamentally flawed. And now? Now it's about proving my grandfather right, I replied, echoing her earlier insight. His founding vision was that communications infrastructure required continuous reinvention ahead of market demand. The current transformation is returning to that principle rather than simply challenging my father's approach. This perspective shift represented the most meaningful personal rebuilding, from reactive defiance to purposeful direction, from challenging the past to creating the future. The $1,000 bequest remained symbolically powerful but had diminished as a motivating force compared to the tangible impact of our modernization initiatives. Harold Dawson captured this evolution during a reflective moment following a particularly successful strategic planning committee meeting. "You began this journey seeking a seat at the table," he observed. "You've ended up redesigning the table itself." The metaphor was apt. Montgomery Industries was being systematically rebuilt, not merely accommodating a previously excluded perspective, but fundamentally reconceiving how the organization functioned in a rapidly evolving technological landscape. The dual leadership structure that emerged from our governance conflict provided the balanced foundation for this comprehensive transformation. As the rebuilding phase gained momentum, expanding from isolated initiatives to organization-wide renewal, my attention increasingly shifted from vindicating my exclusion to maximizing the opportunity that exclusion had inadvertently created. The $1,000 bequest intended as dismissal had initiated a sequence of events that positioned Montgomery Industries for its most significant strategic transformation since my grandfather's original vision. The rebuilding wasn't complete, cultural. Transformation proceeds at a different pace than technological or structural change, but the foundation had been firmly established. Montgomery Industries was evolving beyond both my father's singular vision and my initial reactive positioning, becoming something neither of us had fully anticipated, but that incorporated essential elements from both perspectives. In that evolution lay the true rebuilding, not just of organizational capabilities or market positioning, but of the Montgomery legacy itself. The company would continue bearing our family name, but that name now represented a more adaptive, collaborative approach to leadership than Richard Montgomery had ever envisioned. As we prepared for the next phase of our modernization journey, I found myself looking forward rather than backward, focused on possibilities rather than vindication. The rebuilding had transformed not just the organization, but my relationship to it. From challenging an inheritance denied to creating a legacy that transcended individual authority. The $1,000 bequest remained in my desk drawer, uncashed and increasingly irrelevant to the future we were building. Its power as judgment had been neutralized not through rejection, but through transcendence, creating something more valuable than the inheritance it had attempted to deny. 1 year after the shareholder meeting that established our dual leadership structure, Montgomery Industries reached a milestone that would have seemed impossible during the contentious days of our succession conflict. The comprehensive modernization strategy had progressed from contested vision to operational reality, with integration occurring at multiple levels throughout the organization. The most visible integration manifested in our market positioning. What had begun as parallel narratives, Michael emphasizing stability and reliability, me focusing on innovation and transformation, had evolved into a coherent corporate identity that balanced these seemingly contradictory elements. Our communications positioned Montgomery Industries as the established innovator, leveraging decades of infrastructure expertise while driving technological evolution rather than merely responding to it. This integrated positioning resonated powerfully with both existing clients who valued stability and prospective customers seeking forward-looking solutions. Gregory Vance presented the concrete impact during our annual strategic review. Client retention has increased 7% compared to pre-integration baselines, while new customer acquisition in emerging sectors has accelerated 4%. We're simultaneously strengthening our core business and expanding into high-growth domains. The financial implications were substantial. Montgomery Industries reported 12.6% revenue growth for the full integration year, more than triple the industry average, with profitability metrics exceeding projections despite significant modernization investments. The stock price had appreciated 47% since the leadership transition, reflecting market confidence in our integrated approach. Beyond market positioning and financial metrics, the most meaningful integration occurred within Montgomery's organizational culture. What had begun as distinct operational and strategic factions gradually evolved into a more cohesive enterprise identity that incorporated elements from both leadership perspectives. The Innovation Fellowship Program played a crucial role in this cultural integration, creating a cadre of leaders fluent in both established operational disciplines and emerging technological capabilities. These integrated leaders became the connective tissue between traditionally separate domains, translating between specialized functional languages and facilitating collaborative problem-solving. The fellows have fundamentally changed our decision-making dynamics, observed Patricia Reynolds, our recently appointed Chief Talent Officer. They move comfortably between business units, engineering teams, and executive functions, creating information flow that bypasses traditional silos. This integrated leadership model addressed a fundamental limitation in Richard Montgomery's approach to organizational development. He had built the company around specialized expertise domains with carefully managed interfaces, creating efficiency at the cost of adaptability. Our integrated model maintained functional expertise while creating deliberate overlaps and connections that accelerated learning and innovation. The Madison acquisition, initially a focal point for our leadership, conflict had evolved into the template for this integrated approach. What began as a technology acquisition had transformed into a comprehensive integration of capabilities, methodologies, and cultural elements. Philip Norwood's role had expanded from integration advisor to chief innovation officer, formalizing the bridge between Madison's technological capabilities and Montgomery's established market presence. The integration creates complementary strengths that neither organization possessed independently, Norwood explained during an industry forum where Montgomery showcased its transformed infrastructure offerings. Madison's technological agility, combined with Montgomery's implementation capability and client relationships, creates a differentiated value proposition that competitors struggle to match. This integration extended to our governance approach as well. The initial dual leadership structure, born of shareholder compromise rather than deliberate design, had evolved into a more sophisticated model that leveraged the complementary perspectives Michael and I brought to the enterprise. Rather than competing power centers, we had developed integrated decision processes that incorporated both operational discipline and strategic innovation. Harold Dawson characterized this evolution during a board assessment session. What began as an accommodation of competing claims has become a governance advantage. The integrated leadership model provides balanced perspective that neither traditional CEO authority nor conventional board oversight typically achieves. The integration even manifested in our physical environment. Montgomery Tower had been designed around traditional hierarchical principles, with executive functions occupying the top floors and operational departments arranged in descending order of perceived importance. Our integrated approach required different spatial arrangements to facilitate the collaborative work essential to modernization. The comprehensive renovation of 3 mid-level floors created the Montgomery Innovation Center, an integrated environment where cross-functional teams could collaborate on strategic initiatives without traditional departmental boundaries. The space design physically embodied our integrated philosophy, with flexible configurations replacing fixed hierarchical arrangements. Michael had initially resisted this spatial reorganization, concerned about disrupting established reporting structures and operational patterns. Physical proximity to direct reports ensures accountability and information flow, he argued during planning discussions. Dispersing leadership across integrated project spaces undermines clear lines of authority. The tension reflected our different mental models of organizational effectiveness, Michael emphasizing structured hierarchy, me prioritizing adaptive networks. The integrated solution maintained departmental home bases while creating dedicated integration spaces for strategic initiatives, requiring cross-functional collaboration. This balanced approach preserved necessary operational structure while enabling the fluid connections essential for innovation. The most profound integration occurred in our approach to the Montgomery legacy itself. What began as competing interpretations, Michael championing Richard's emphasis on operational control, me advocating my grandfather's focus on technological foresight, evolved into an integrated understanding that incorporated vital elements from both traditions. This integrated perspective emerged clearly during the dedication ceremony for the William Montgomery Innovation Center, named for my grandfather rather than my father in recognition of its focus on technological transformation. Michael surprised me with his remarks at the event. Montgomery Industries has always balanced 2 essential principles, he noted, addressing assembled employees and industry representatives: operational excellence that delivers reliable performance for customers, and technological vision that anticipates market evolution before it becomes obvious. At different points in our history, one principle has sometimes overshadowed the other. Today, we recommit to the integrated approach that has proven most effective: disciplined operations. Informed by forward-looking vision, the statement represented significant evolution in Michael's perspective. Rather than positioning Richard's operational emphasis as the definitive Montgomery approach, he acknowledged the complementary value of our grandfather's innovation focus. This wasn't concession but integration, recognizing that the company's future depended on balancing these traditionally competing priorities. My own perspective had evolved similarly. Where I had initially positioned modernization as repudiation of Richard's approach, I now recognized the essential foundation his operational discipline provided for innovation initiatives. Technological transformation succeeds when built upon operational excellence, I noted during my portion of the dedication remarks. The Montgomery tradition encompasses both visionary innovation and disciplined execution, complementary strengths that we are reintegrating in our current approach. This balanced perspective diffused much of the tension that had characterized our early leadership interactions. We maintained distinct responsibilities, aligned with our respective strengths. Michael focusing on operational execution, me on strategic direction, but within an integrated framework that acknowledged the interdependence of these domains. The integration extended to our personal relationship as well, though with more measured progress. Our weekly coordination meetings evolved from formal information exchange to more substantive discussion, occasionally verging toward genuine collaboration. While familial warmth remained elusive, professional respect deepened as integrated results validated the complementary nature of our contributions. This developing relationship was tested when Montgomery Industries faced its first significant integration challenge: the accelerated deployment of our next-generation network management platform encountered unexpected compatibility issues with legacy systems, creating service disruptions for several major clients. The situation demanded immediate response that integrated both operational recovery and strategic adjustment. In previous phases of our leadership evolution, such a crisis might have exacerbated tensions between operational and strategic priorities. The integrated approach we had developed enabled more effective response, Michael directing immediate service restoration while I adjusted the deployment roadmap to incorporate emerging compatibility requirements. The integrated response prevented the situation from becoming either a tactical band-aid that ignored strategic implications or a strategic reset that neglected immediate client needs, Gregory Vance observed during our post-incident review. Neither perspective alone would have produced optimal resolution. This practical demonstration of integrated leadership strengthened boardroom confidence in our governance model. The quarterly directors' meeting following the incident included formal discussion of making the dual leadership structure permanent rather than transitional, institutionalizing the integrated approach that had proven effective during both standard operations and crisis response. The board initially approved this arrangement as conflict resolution, Harold Dawson noted during the discussion. We should now consider formalizing it as Montgomery's governance model based on demonstrated results, rather than compromise considerations. The proposal represented significant evolution in the board's perspective. What began as reluctant accommodation of competing claims had transformed into recognition of integrated leadership as a strategic advantage rather than merely a political settlement. Beyond governance structures, the integration profoundly influenced Montgomery's positioning within the broader telecommunications ecosystem. Richard Montgomery had built the company as a self-contained entity that maintained comprehensive control over all critical functions. Our integrated approach incorporated selective partnerships and strategic alliances that enabled access to specialized capabilities while maintaining core competitive differentiation. The integrated model allows us to maintain control where it creates distinctive value while leveraging external capabilities where partnerships accelerate progress. I explained during an industry analyst briefing on Montgomery's ecosystem strategy. This balanced approach delivers faster innovation without compromising essential competitive advantages. This integration of internal and external capabilities represented perhaps the most fundamental departure from Richard Montgomery's leadership philosophy. He had equated comprehensive control with strategic strength, viewing any dependence on external capabilities as potential vulnerability. Our integrated approach recognized that the accelerating pace of technological evolution made such self-contained approaches increasingly untenable. The essence of integration manifested most clearly in our approach to the Montgomery legacy itself. What began as competing narratives about Richard's intention and judgment had evolved into a more nuanced understanding that transcended individual personalities. Montgomery Industries wasn't simply Richard's company or William's vision. It was an evolving enterprise that drew strength from multiple traditions while adapting to contemporary realities. I reflected on this evolution during a quiet moment following the board's formal vote to institutionalize our integrated leadership model. The $1,000 bequest that once symbolized my father's dismissive judgment now seemed like a historical curiosity, an artifact from a perspective that had been transcended rather than merely challenged. The dual leadership structure born from that conflict had evolved into something neither Richard nor I had anticipated, a genuinely integrated approach that strengthened the enterprise he had spent his life building. As we prepared for Montgomery Industries' 75th anniversary celebration, an event that would honor the company's history while positioning its future direction, I found myself at peace with the complex legacy of Richard Montgomery's leadership. His $1,000 bequest had not defined me, nor limited my impact on the enterprise that bore our family name. Instead, it had initiated a sequence of events that ultimately strengthened the company through integration of complementary perspectives that might otherwise have remained in perpetual competition. The integration was neither victory nor concession, but transcendence, moving beyond the binary opposition of competing leadership philosophies to create something more balanced and adaptive than either approach alone could have produced. Montgomery Industries had evolved beyond being either Richard's company or my vision. It had become an integrated enterprise that honored multiple traditions while charting its own distinctive course. My grandfather William had established Montgomery Industries on the principle that communications infrastructure must evolve ahead of consumer demand, rather than merely responding to it. My father, Richard, had built the company's operational discipline and market position through methodical control and optimization. The integrated approach Michael and I had developed incorporated essential elements from both traditions while adapting them for contemporary technological and market realities. In that integration lay the company's true strength, not in choosing between competing traditions, but in synthesizing their complementary wisdom while transcending their respective limitations. The $1,000 bequest that once seemed to be my father's final judgment had instead become the catalyst for an integrated approach that would carry the Montgomery legacy forward in ways none of us had fully anticipated. As I prepared my remarks for the anniversary celebration, I found myself focusing not on vindication or criticism, but on continuation. How each generation of Montgomery leadership had contributed essential elements to an evolving enterprise that remained relevant precisely because it integrated tradition and transformation rather than choosing between them. The journey from that devastating moment at the will reading to this integrated leadership model had transformed not just Montgomery Industries, but my understanding of legacy itself. True legacy isn't measured in inheritance amounts or posthumous judgments, but in the living impact of principles, capabilities, and organizational cultures that transcend individual leadership tenures. Richard Montgomery's $1,000 bequest had not diminished my impact on the enterprise bearing our family name. Instead, it had inadvertently created conditions for an integrated approach that strengthened the company beyond what either his singular vision or my reactive positioning could have accomplished independently. In that unexpected outcome lay the true resolution of our leadership conflict, not victory for either perspective, but integration of complementary strengths that created something greater than the sum of its competing parts. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.